You meet someone and something inside you reacts before you even know why, before you've exchanged more than a few words, before you've learned anything about their story or their life. Something in your body tells you that they feel familiar, not just in the way strangers sometimes remind you of someone you once knew, but in a much deeper, heavier way, like a part of you recognizes something buried in them. And it doesn't make sense because you know you've never met them before. And yet your mind feels strangely calm in their presence, like it's been waiting for them. At first you think it's just chemistry, that strange spark people sometimes talk about, but then it doesn't feel like that either, because it's not just attraction and it's not just comfort, it's both at once and something more, something you can't quite explain, like gravity in the room has changed. Like this person has stepped into your world and pulled something to the surface that you didn't know was there, and you don't know what to do with it. You try to act normal, but your attention keeps going back to them, and you don't understand why your mind is building bridges so quickly, why your imagination is filling in stories about them, why every word they say feels like a continuation of something you already knew, even though you know this is the first time your paths have crossed. Later you find out something strange, something that changes the entire shape of the feeling you've been having, something that makes the emotional charge make sense in a way that scares you or confuses you or makes you question your own reactions, because the person you've just met, the one who felt so familiar, so powerful, so emotionally magnetic, turns out to be biologically related to you. Not someone you grew up with, not someone who raised you or shared a bedroom wall with you or fought over the remote control during childhood, but someone you were separated from early, maybe at birth, maybe during the first year of life, maybe through adoption, maybe through a hospital mix-up, maybe through life simply pulling people apart and not giving them the chance to know each other. They are your blood, your sibling, your parent, your child. And your brain, which had no memory of them, had no learned boundaries or categories to assign them to, didn't know what to do when it finally saw them again, not with recognition, not with memory, but with a raw emotional imprint that had been waiting for closure ever since you were separated. This is not a love story. This is not about romance. This is about the misfiring of attachment systems, the confusion that arises when the human brain, designed to bond early and define roles like mother or brother or child, is denied the chance to make those definitions at the proper time. And then later, when it finally encounters the person it was meant to bond with, it doesn't know what to do, so it pulls the emotional lever anyway, and the signal that was supposed to say family instead says something far more complicated. Psychologists once called this phenomenon genetic sexual attraction, a term now largely abandoned because of how misleading it sounds, how much it suggests desire rather than confusion, choice rather than miswiring, and instead, a better way to understand it is as genetic emotional imprinting, a phrase that reflects what's actually happening, an intense emotional reaction rooted not in intention but in instinct, in the automatic systems of the brain that were never properly calibrated. The imprint was there, like a program waiting for the right trigger, and when that person appeared, even decades later, even with no context or clues, the mind responded as if something vital had been restored, as if something lost had returned, but it didn't know how to name that restoration. And so it named it with the closest emotional language it had: connection, intensity, longing, even love. And this is where it becomes difficult to talk about, because people feel ashamed of what they felt, even when they didn't act on it, even when they did nothing wrong, because the feeling itself doesn't make sense in the way we usually expect feelings to make sense. There is no memory of shared moments, no history, no narrative, just a pull, a signal, a depth of attention that seems disproportionate to the situation. Now imagine this is you. You've lived your life assuming that your emotions come from logic, from memory, from shared experience. But now here you are, face to face with someone who has done nothing except enter a room, and your emotions are rising like they've known this person for years. You're careful, you try to stay grounded, but the conversations go deeper, faster. The trust forms instantly. And underneath everything, there's a strange comfort, like your nervous system has relaxed in their presence in a way it rarely does with others, like your body remembers something that your mind do. Is not. And then you learn who they are. A part of you feels horror, a part of you feels clarity, a part of you feels relief that at least now you understand, but none of that makes the emotions disappear, because they weren't built on ideas, they were built on internal responses, on chemicals, on bonding circuits designed to form in the first months of life. Circuits that were paused, not broken, and now they've finally lit up, years too late, in the wrong order, in the wrong context, but just as strong. In a well-known case in the UK, two adults, both adopted into separate families, met later in life and experienced exactly this: a powerful emotional connection that quickly turned into an intense relationship, one that only stopped when they discovered that they were in fact full siblings. Their story became public and the reactions were strong, divided, full of judgment and discomfort, but the psychologists who examined the case weren't surprised. They had seen it before. They had studied it. They understood that it wasn't about desire. It was about incomplete emotional systems finishing themselves the only way they knew how. Children bond to their caregivers through repetition, through proximity, through physical cues, through eye contact, smell, tone of voice, facial recognition, and all of this happens in the background, shaping the brain's sense of safety, of trust, of emotional hierarchy. And once those patterns are established, they tend to stay. You don't question the categories of your relationships because they were set early and clearly. But when the early bonding doesn't happen, when you are raised without that genetic relative, when your brain never has the chance to assign them a place, those emotional categories remain blank. Then, when the person finally appears, the mind doesn't know what to do. It recognizes genetic similarity, the way someone moves, the way their voice rises and falls, the shape of their face or hands or smile. But without memory to assign to it, the recognition feels new, not familiar, and the brain wrongly interprets it as potential intimacy rather than as kinship. This creates a confusing and deeply emotional experience, one that feels real but is built on mistaken context. It's not dangerous by itself, but it can lead to emotional pain, to guilt, to shame, especially when people don't know what's happening, when they think it's just them, when they fear that something is wrong with their feelings. In truth, it's the system that misfired, not the person. Therapists who work with these cases focus on education, on helping individuals understand the mechanism behind the feeling, helping them see that emotions don't always mean what they seem to mean, that feelings can arise from old, unfinished patterns in the brain, patterns that were meant to create family bonds but never got the chance. And once that's understood, there is space to grieve, space to process, space to build new emotional categories with better context, without judgment. What this teaches us is something deeper than the phenomenon itself. It teaches us that emotions are not always reliable, that familiarity can come from recognition without memory, that longing can come from unfinished scripts, and that the deepest pulls of the heart are sometimes just signals from a system that never got to complete itself properly. You might think you know where your feelings come from. But what if some of them were installed before you could even speak? What if they were just waiting for the right trigger? And what if that trigger had a face, a voice, a presence that you had never seen before? Would you trust the feeling? Or would you step back and ask what part of you is speaking? Because sometimes it's not desire. Sometimes it's the ghost of a bond that never had the chance to be made. You don't usually think about your earliest feelings, most people don't, but they're there in the background, still shaping the way you relate to others, and some of those feelings go deeper than people are comfortable admitting. Some are strong, hidden, and hard to talk about, not because they're bad, but because they were never fully understood. One of those feelings is called Oedipal Attachment. It's a psychological pattern that begins in early childhood, usually between the ages of 3 and 6. It happens when a child forms a deep emotional attachment to the parent of the opposite sex, not just as a caregiver or protector, but as someone they want all to themselves. It's not romantic, it's not conscious, it's not even something they can explain, but it's powerful. The child begins to see the other parent, the one of the same sex, as competition. They want attention, affection, presence, and emotional closeness, and they don't want to share it. In their mind, that one parent is theirs, and anyone else feels like a threat. This feeling doesn't come from anything wrong. It's actually part of how children learn emotional boundaries. In healthy development, it fades over time. The child starts to understand family roles, starts to separate their own identity from their parents, and begins to form other relationships with friends, with siblings, with teachers. But sometimes that shift doesn't happen cleanly. The emotional attachment doesn't fully resolve. It lingers, it grows quiet but not gone. And as the child becomes a teenager, then an adult, that unresolved pattern can show up in other relationships, especially romantic ones, without the person ever realizing where it came from. Imagine this. You're in your mid-20s. You've had a few relationships, some good, some confusing. There's a pattern you've noticed, but you can't quite explain it. You're drawn to people who remind you of someone not always in appearance, but in energy. Their voice, their presence, the way they talk to you. It feels familiar, sometimes too familiar. You trust them easily. You feel safe around them. but you also feel a need to impress them, to earn their approval, to be the one they choose again and again. When they pull away even a little, you feel rejected, almost like a child being told to go back to their room. When they're kind, you light up. When they're distant, you start to panic. You begin to shape your words, your actions, even your emotions just to keep their attention. You want to be the only one they see, not because you're selfish, but because something inside you is still fighting for that spotlight, that special place, the place that once felt like it was only yours. Then one day you realize something strange. You compare the person you're with to your parent, not directly, not intentionally, but it happens. Maybe they speak in a similar tone, maybe they have the same sense of humor, maybe they even smell a little like them or hold their fork the same way, and suddenly you feel unsettled. You start to wonder whether this is just coincidence or whether something older is still playing out beneath the surface. This isn't rare and it isn't shameful. Psychologists have known about this for over a century. The term Oedipal comes from a character in Greek tragedy Oedipus, who, without knowing, fulfills a prophecy by harming his father and marrying his mother. But in psychology, the idea is not literal. It's symbolic. It's about emotional development. It's about how children build their identity in relation to their parents, and how that early attachment shapes the kind of closeness they look for later in life. A young boy, for example, may feel especially attached to his mother. He may want her attention more than anything else. When she focuses on his father, he may feel left out or even jealous, though he doesn't have the words for it. He doesn't want anything inappropriate. He just wants to be the center of her world. He wants to be seen, important, chosen. At the same time, he sees his father as a rival, someone who gets the attention he wants, someone who is bigger, stronger, harder to compete with. This creates a conflict inside him, a quiet one, but a powerful one. Over time, if the family is healthy, the child begins to understand that he doesn't have to win his mother, that her love isn't something to compete for, and he starts to identify more with his father instead, learning from him, finding a new emotional role model, letting go of that early competition. But when something interrupts that process, maybe the parents are emotionally distant, maybe the father is absent, maybe the bond with the mother is too strong or too blurred, the child doesn't fully separate. That emotional script stays open. And as he grows up, he might keep looking for someone who gives him the same feeling he once had or wanted from his mother. Not in a conscious way, not because he wants to recreate anything inappropriate, but because the brain is trying to finish an emotional sentence it started years ago. The same is true for girls in what is sometimes called the Electra Pattern. A young girl may feel very connected to her father. She may want to be the person he smiles at, the person he talks to first, the one he spends time with. She watches how he treats her mother, and part of her, without knowing it, wonders why she isn't the one who gets that kind of closeness. She may feel proud when he compliments her, and hurt when he doesn't notice. Over time, she's supposed to learn how to separate, to build her identity apart from her parents. But again, if the emotional roles are unclear, if the bond is too strong, or if the emotional needs aren't met in healthy ways, that separation may never happen fully. In adulthood, this can show up in unexpected places. People may find themselves drawn to partners who fit the emotional mold of their opposite-sex parent, sometimes even to people with the same flaws, the same emotional unavailability, the same distance. And they might not understand why. They just know that those relationships feel intense, important, hard to walk away from, even when they aren't healthy. The Oedipal attachment doesn't mean someone has done something wrong. It doesn't mean the child or the parent failed. It simply means that something important, a developmental step, didn't fully complete. And because of that, the brain keeps trying to resolve it, in subtle ways, in romantic relationships, in conflict, in patterns of need, jealousy, control, or withdrawal. When someone with unresolved Oedipal attachment enters a relationship, they often bring unspoken expectations. They want to feel chosen, they want deep approval, they want to matter more than anyone else. And when they don't get that, when their partner acts independently or pulls away or gives attention to others, they may feel hurt in ways that don't match the moment. They may overreact, they may spiral, because for them, it's not just about the current relationship. It's about something older, something unfinished. Therapists who recognize this pattern often work gently. They help people trace the emotions backward, not to blame the past, but to understand it, to see how early roles, early bonds, and early wounds shape adult choices. And once that connection is clear, people can start to make different decisions. They can build boundaries. They can learn to separate old needs from new ones. They can begin to love others for who they are, not for what they represent. Oedipal attachment is not a flaw. It's a story the brain tried to tell but never finished. And it shows us just how much of our emotional world is shaped before we can name it, before we can defend it, before we can understand what it is we're actually feeling. You may have gone your whole life thinking your choices were random, that your attractions were just chemistry, that your relationships were just luck or failure. But what if part of you was still searching for something you missed at age 5? What if every time you felt rejected, you were really feeling a memory from childhood, one you don't even remember? What if the love you've been chasing isn't about this person or that person, but about a version of closeness that your brain never got to grow out of? And what happens when you finally see it? Do you keep chasing? Or do you stop, turn around, and finally give your younger self the permission to let go? There's something you've always felt around certain people, something quiet, something hard to describe, something that pulls you toward them even when you try not to notice it, and it doesn't come from logic or choice or even attraction in the usual sense. It feels older than that, like a shadow of something you once needed, something you once hoped for, something your mind never got to finish understanding. You walk into a room and you see someone who makes you feel calm, safe, important. They carry themselves in a certain way. Maybe they have a kind face or a steady voice. Maybe they seem sure of themselves without being arrogant. Maybe they remind you of someone not in how they look, but in how they make you feel. You trust them quickly. You listen more closely when they speak. You find yourself smiling without meaning to. You feel noticed. And then later, when you reflect on the interaction, you realize something strange. That feeling, that warmth, that hunger to be close, it's not just about them. It's familiar, but not from the present. It's something you felt before, long ago, and suddenly your memory goes back, not to a friend or a partner, but to your father. Not because anything was wrong, not because anything happened, but because there was a time once when he was the most important person in your world. And for a little girl, that kind of attachment, that powerful, early bond, can shape the way her mind understands closeness for the rest of her life. In psychology, this is known as the Electra Pattern. It's the counterpart to the Oedipal Attachment, and it describes what happens when a young girl forms a deep emotional connection to her father during early development, one that becomes so important, so central, that it quietly defines how she understands love, attention, and value, sometimes long after she's grown up. At around the age of 3 to 6 years old, children go through a period where they begin to form stronger attachments to the parent of the opposite sex. This is a normal part of emotional development. The child looks to that parent as a source of warmth, attention, affection, and approval. For little girls, that often means the father becomes a kind of emotional star, someone she wants to be close to, someone she wants to impress, someone she wants all to herself. She may feel proud when he notices her. She may feel jealous when he gives attention to others. She may interrupt conversations, try to imitate his gestures, ask for his opinion even in small things. In her world, his approval is everything. She wants to feel chosen, special, irreplaceable. This attachment is not romantic, it's not conscious, it's not something the child understands in words. It's a blueprint, a script, an emotional pattern forming silently in the background, teaching her what love feels like and what she needs to do to get it. In healthy development, this phase passes. The child begins to form a stronger sense of identity, separate from her parents. She starts to look outward, toward friends, school, hobbies, and the emotional bond with her father shifts into something more balanced, something more rooted in the roles of family. She understands that she doesn't need to compete for attention, that love isn't a prize, that her worth isn't tied to being the favorite. The script fades. But sometimes that process is interrupted. Maybe the father is distant, emotionally unavailable, absent, or inconsistent. Maybe he gives too much attention and creates dependence. Maybe the mother is emotionally disconnected, and the daughter turns to the father for the kind of closeness she can't find elsewhere. Whatever the reason, the attachment doesn't complete itself. It lingers. It stays open, unfinished. And as that little girl becomes a woman, the emotional script begins to play out in other places, most often in romantic relationships. She may find herself drawn to men who carry the same emotional weight her father once did, men who are strong, distant, hard to reach, or men who are warm, protective, and affirming, but only if she works for their approval. She may chase relationships where she has to prove her value. She may fall for people who make her feel like a child again, small, nervous, excited, eager. She may tolerate behaviors she shouldn't just to hold on to the feeling of being chosen. Or she may fear intimacy altogether, pushing people away before they get too close, because deep down she believes no one will ever love her like that again. These patterns don't always look dramatic. Sometimes they're quiet, a string of relationships that don't feel right, a deep discomfort with vulnerability, a tendency to chase unavailable partners or to lose interest the moment someone offers love freely. These aren't conscious decisions, they're reflexes, emotional habits, and most people never trace them back to childhood because it doesn't occur to them that something so long ago could still be shaping their choices today. But the mind doesn't forget emotional blueprints. It carries them silently until something in the present activates them again. A tone of voice, a style of affection, a power dynamic, the way someone listens or doesn't, the way they disappear or return, all of it can trigger the same emotional loop. Notice me, choose me, don't leave me. And the worst part is, you may not realize you're doing it. You may think you're falling in love, but what you're really doing is trying to finish a story your brain started when you were 5. In some cases, the Electra pattern can lead to repeated disappointment because no partner can fully live up to the emotional fantasy built around a parent, especially when that fantasy was shaped by longing, confusion, or lack. In other cases, it leads to toxic cycles, clinging to people who offer attention and then withdraw it, trying to fix broken men, trying to earn love instead of receiving it freely. And still, in other cases, it simply creates confusion. A vague sense that relationships feel off, that something important is missing, but you don't know what it is. Therapists who recognize this pattern don't judge it. They explore it with compassion. They help clients look back at their early bonds, at the ways they were seen or unseen, at the silent contracts they made with themselves. If I behave a certain way, I'll get love. If I'm special enough, I'll be noticed. If I'm quiet or clever or helpful, I'll be protected. And once those old contracts are seen clearly, they can be rewritten. You don't have to chase love, you don't have to earn it, you don't have to prove your worth over and over again. What you longed for as a child was real, the pain of not receiving it fully was real, but you're not that child anymore, and the people you choose now are not your father, they are not there to complete your past, they're there to meet you as you are now if you let them. So if you've ever found yourself confused by your own feelings, drawn to people who make you feel safe but small, or desperate but invisible, maybe it's not because you're broken. Maybe it's because a part of you is still waiting for something that never fully arrived. And the question is not whether that longing was wrong. It usually begins quietly, not with a moment of impact, not with a dramatic scene or a love at first sight cliché, but with something far more subtle, something that slips past your conscious mind and settles into your body like a background vibration you can't unhear, a certain tone in their voice, a certain softness in the way they speak your name, a gesture that catches your eye and refuses to leave your thoughts, and in that small, seemingly insignificant exchange, something inside you lights up. Not in a loud way, but in a way that feels deeply personal, like you've found a thread in the world that was meant only for you to follow. And so, without realizing it, you begin to follow. At first it feels normal, a small interest, a curiosity, an innocent wondering, and you tell yourself that you're just intrigued, just fascinated, just noticing something special. But soon your thoughts are circling them more often, and then constantly, until you find that you're measuring your day by how close or far they feel from your mental space, until the tone of your mood begins to rise and fall depending on how recently you've heard from them, how they looked at you, whether they smiled, whether they seemed distracted or present or distant or unreachable. You begin to replay moments in your head, but not like memories, more like scripts, scenes, rewrites, taking what actually happened and stretching it into what could have happened, what you wish had happened, what you imagine would have happened if only things had tilted 1 degree differently. And you know somewhere deep down that you're building something that doesn't exist, but you can't stop, because the version you've created feels better than anything else. It feels like hope, like fuel. Like emotional oxygen in a quiet, slow-burning way. This isn't love, not in the real, grounded, reciprocal sense of the word. It is something else, something lighter in contact but heavier in impact, something psychologists once called limerence, now more clearly referred to as obsessive infatuation syndrome, a state of emotional fixation in which one person becomes the center of another's inner world, often without the depth or time or reality required to justify such importance, and yet the intensity is unmistakably real. Even when the foundation is imagined, you begin to attach meaning to everything they do. You interpret silences as signals, glances as affirmations, pauses as clues, and soon you are decoding them like a language you were born to learn, watching for patterns that may not exist, reaching for signs of connection that might only live in your own narrative, and the longer this continues, the more tangled you become in a story that is unfolding mostly in your own mind. Where every interaction is a chapter, and every absence is a cliffhanger, and every smile is a plot twist that keeps you emotionally locked in. You might tell yourself you're just sensitive, just emotionally open, just hopeful, but the truth begins to show in how much control they begin to have over your attention, how every distraction returns to them, how your joy rises when they're warm and your anxiety spikes when they're cold, how your energy depends not on how your day went but on how they responded, or didn't respond, or didn't even notice, and still, you remain wrapped in the idea that maybe, one day, they will see you the way you already see them, completely, powerfully, permanently. What makes obsessive infatuation so powerful is not just the intensity of the feeling, but how little it needs to survive. It can be fueled by the smallest interactions, by passing comments, by imagined futures, and it thrives best in uncertainty, because uncertainty gives the mind room to wander, to build, to exaggerate, and because the relationship isn't fully real, it can never truly disappoint you, which also means it can never really satisfy you either. It becomes a loop. An endless loop of anticipation, idealization, and letdown, followed by renewed hope and another cycle through the same emotional maze. You begin to lose your grounding in the present, because the present is where this relationship lives. It lives in the future you imagine and the past you rewrite, and your real connection to them is minimal, often circumstantial or surface level, but the emotional connection you feel is deep, consuming, and internal, and that makes it hard to explain to others, hard to justify to yourself, and even harder to let go of because the feelings are genuine, even if the foundation is fragile. You might try to gain their attention more often, subtly at first, by laughing a little louder when they're nearby, by changing the way you dress, by timing your appearances to overlap with theirs, and when those small moves don't work, you might shift into overthinking, into strategizing, into self-doubt, wondering if you were too much or not enough, too distant or too eager, and soon you find yourself emotionally negotiating with a version of them that lives only in your imagination, trying to win a game that they don't even know they're part of. And when they give you something, a smile, a question, a shared moment, it feels like a victory, like proof that what you feel is real. But the problem is that it never lasts because real connection requires mutual presence. And in this situation, only one of you is truly present. The other is often unaware or unavailable or simply not engaged in the same emotional intensity, which turns their every action into a test and your every reaction into another layer of entanglement. You might notice that you're neglecting other parts of your life, your friends, your goals, your interests. Not because you want to, but because your energy is being drained by something that doesn't replenish you, and you tell yourself that it's temporary, that it will fade, but it doesn't, not easily, because the emotional part of your brain doesn't respond to logic. It responds to emotional reward, to fantasy, to unresolved longing. And that's exactly what obsessive infatuation provides. A constant sense of unfinished emotional business. You might begin to question your own stability, to feel embarrassed by your behavior, to swing between hope and despair, and the shame makes it harder to talk about, harder to get help, harder to pull away, because now you're not just addicted to the person, you're trapped inside the story you've created about them. And stepping away would feel like abandoning not just them, but the entire emotional meaning you've built around them. Psychologically, obsessive infatuation often emerges from unmet emotional needs, from past experiences where love was inconsistent, or attention was earned through performance, or validation was rare and unpredictable. And in that context, the fantasy of being fully seen by someone becomes more than a want. It becomes a need, a correction, a chance to rewrite emotional history. And so when you meet someone who triggers that feeling, your brain reacts not with curiosity, but with urgency. With hunger, with obsession. And it's not your fault. Your mind is trying to give you a feeling you didn't get enough of, to be chosen, adored, noticed without condition. And this person has become the symbol of that missing piece, the placeholder for a deeper need, which makes the attachment feel enormous, overwhelming, and impossible to resolve. The truth is, you don't need them. You need what you believe they represent: wholeness, safety, self-worth, and the tragedy of obsession is that it convinces you that those things live inside someone else, when in fact they can only be reclaimed by you. Letting go of obsessive infatuation is not about cutting off your emotions or pretending they don't exist. It's about redirecting them, about learning to sit with the part of you that's still waiting to be seen, to be loved, to be enough, and slowly reminding that part of yourself that its worth is not defined by anyone else's attention. When you begin to see that, you no longer need them to complete the story, because you realize the story was never about them in the first place. You don't usually think of loyalty as something that can be dangerous. You grow up believing that loyalty is a virtue, something earned through kindness, something built through trust and shared experience. And yet there are moments in life where loyalty forms not in safety, but in fear, not in connection, but in survival, moments where your brain rewires the meaning of closeness because the person standing in front of you has become both the source of harm and the only possible shelter from it. And when that happens, something inside you shifts without your permission. Your instincts reach for the only form of stability they can find, and they attach to the person who has the power to hurt you but occasionally chooses not to, and your mind, needing safety more than anything else, starts calling that kindness. This is where Stockholm Syndrome begins, not as a conscious decision, not as a failure of strength or intelligence, but as a psychological response to extreme stress, isolation, or power imbalance. It happens when someone becomes emotionally bonded to the person who is harming, controlling, or manipulating them. And that bond is not a result of affection, it is a result of survival. It is your mind doing what it must to reduce fear in a situation where escape doesn't feel possible. Where resistance seems too dangerous, where no other emotional anchor exists except the one tied to the person who is both the captor and the caretaker. At its origin, the term comes from a real event, a bank robbery in Stockholm, Sweden in 1973, where hostages were held for 6 days. During that time, something unexpected occurred. The hostages began to identify with their captors. They expressed sympathy for them, defended them after release, and even refused to testify against them in court. The world was confused, law enforcement was baffled, and psychologists gave the response a name: Stockholm Syndrome. A pattern in which a victim of abuse or captivity forms a psychological alliance with their abuser, sometimes even showing affection, loyalty, or protection toward the very person causing them harm. But this phenomenon is not limited to bank vaults or hostage situations. It is not a rare psychological oddity locked away in case studies or dramatic news stories. It happens far more often, and in much more familiar places: in homes, in relationships, in families, in workplaces, in any environment where someone has control over you and you don't feel free to leave. And over time, your fear slowly becomes dependence, and your dependence becomes emotional attachment. And that attachment becomes a bond you can't easily break, because it's wrapped in the belief that you need this person to survive, emotionally, physically, psychologically. Imagine now that you are living in a relationship where one person dominates every decision, where you feel like you're always walking on eggshells, where affection is given only when you behave a certain way, where mistakes are punished with silence or shouting or threats, and where the rules are always shifting, and no matter how hard you try, you never quite feel secure. At first you're angry, maybe you think about leaving, maybe you tell yourself this isn't normal, but then come the apologies, the explanations. The moments of kindness, the soft voice after the storm, the look that says maybe they didn't mean it, maybe they're just broken, maybe you're the one person who can love them enough to fix it. And slowly, those moments of peace become more important to you than the reality of the harm. You begin to focus on the good, on the brief windows of calm, on the gestures that feel like love, even if they are surrounded by chaos. You start telling yourself that the situation isn't as bad as it seems, that every relationship has problems, that at least they care enough to come back, to hold you after they hurt you, to say the right words even if they never follow through, and in doing so, your brain begins to rewrite the story, not to deceive you, but to protect you. Because acknowledging the full weight of your pain would require you to confront the fact that you may be trapped, and if you don't believe there's a way out, then believing in their potential becomes your only emotional shelter. And so the bond deepens. You begin to identify with them, you understand their pain, you rationalize their behavior, you absorb their anger as your fault, and in time you may even defend them to others, refusing to tell your friends the full story, avoiding the questions they ask, justifying the things that once horrified you, because now leaving doesn't just feel difficult, it feels like betrayal, not of yourself, but of the person who sometimes shows you softness, and in your mind that softness has become everything. It has become the currency of hope, the proof that things can change, the emotional anchor that keeps you from drifting into the full truth of your situation. This is the silent machinery of Stockholm Syndrome. It doesn't scream, it whispers. It doesn't chain you physically, it convinces you emotionally. It tells you that your safety depends on their approval, that their affection is worth your pain, that your loyalty is a sign of strength, not entrapment. And because the cycle includes both harm and comfort, your nervous system learns to interpret their warmth not as reward, but as relief, and in that relief, you forget that it was their harm that created the pain in the first place. And if someone tries to pull you out, a friend, a therapist, even your own conscience, you may feel resistance, not because you enjoy the suffering, but because the bond you've formed feels real, it feels meaningful. It feels like the one constant in a world that doesn't understand. And you've convinced yourself that they know you, that they care in their own way, that what you have is different, special, complex. And while that may be true in parts, it does not erase the damage, the fear, the control. and the emotional dependency that has formed around the very person who destabilized you. You may even begin to think that leaving would destroy them, that you are their only source of stability, their only real connection, that without you they would fall apart, and this belief becomes another chain, another reason to stay, another way your loyalty is weaponized against you, not by them explicitly, but by your own sense of responsibility. And what you don't realize is that staying for them is slowly eroding you, because every day you stay, you tell your own body that your safety comes second. Stockholm Syndrome doesn't mean you're weak, it doesn't mean you're broken, it doesn't mean you chose this. It means that your brain, in a moment of powerlessness, reached for the only kind of order it could find, and it built a pattern around that. It built emotional logic around instability, and now that logic feels like love, but love is not built on fear, and trust is not built on control, and kindness should not have to be earned through compliance. The most dangerous thing about Stockholm Syndrome is that it feels safe. In the moments when the storm passes, in the quiet after the shouting, in the apologies that sound so real, in the eyes that seem to say they're sorry, in the hand that reaches for you after they've broken something in you, because in those moments your body releases tension, and the contrast between pain and comfort is so stark that it creates a high, a kind of emotional chemical reward, and that high becomes addictive. Not because you enjoy the cycle, but because your system starts believing that the comfort is real and that it's enough. But it's not. Healing from Stockholm Syndrome begins when you stop asking whether they meant to hurt you and start asking why it ever became your job to interpret pain as love, when you stop defending their better moments and start protecting your most vulnerable ones, when you realize that affection given after damage is not affection. It is damage control, and that someone who truly loves you would never use kindness as a tool of re-entry after hurting you. You are allowed to want connection, you are allowed to need support, but you are not required to accept harm in exchange for it. You are not responsible for their healing if they are the one breaking you. You are not selfish for stepping away from someone who confuses your body into calling survival intimacy. Stockholm Syndrome is not your fault. It is your system adapting to fear. And once that fear begins to fade, once you see the pattern for what it is, once you name the confusion, the loyalty, the hesitation, once you say it out loud, you begin to separate your identity from the attachment. You begin to remember who you were before their approval mattered more than your own peace. You begin to unlearn the idea that love is something to be managed like danger, that comfort must come after pain. That holding on is a strength, when sometimes letting go is the first real act of self-respect. And when that moment comes, even if it's quiet, even if it's slow, you will feel something shift, something small, something honest, something that says, "This is not love, this is survival wearing love's mask, and I deserve something that doesn't have to be survived." You tell yourself this is normal, or at least not that bad. You tell yourself that everyone has ups and downs, that love isn't perfect, that maybe you're too sensitive, that maybe they're going through something, that maybe if you just try harder, say the right things, stay calm, stay loving, stay loyal, it will get better. And then it does for a while. The mood shifts, the voice softens, the tension fades, and they hold you like they never hurt you, and you feel safe again, maybe even grateful. Like the pain was a test you passed, like the peace you're feeling now was something you earned by enduring what came before. This is the cycle, not of healthy love, but of trauma bonding, a psychological phenomenon where intense emotional connections form between a victim and an abuser, not in spite of the abuse, but because of the intermittent nature of the abuse, the mixture of cruelty and care, fear and comfort, punishment and reward, which slowly reshapes your emotional logic, so that pain becomes the price of love and relief becomes the proof of it, a bond built not through genuine trust, but through survival instincts twisted into attachment. You might not even realize it at first because the moments of calm are real, the gestures of care are real, the apologies sound real, and the person who hurts you is also the person who sometimes makes you feel safe, makes you laugh, remembers your favorite things, tells you they need you. And in those moments, your nervous system releases the tension it's been holding, and that release feels like affection, like connection, like healing. But in truth, it is not healing, it is reset. The reset that keeps the cycle spinning. Imagine you are in a relationship, romantic, familial, professional, where you feel like you're constantly on edge, where you never know what version of the person you'll get, where love is conditional, where apologies are frequent but never followed by change, where kindness is weaponized, withheld when you need it, then given when you comply, and slowly you start to see their validation as a reward, their anger as a warning, their mood as your responsibility. And the emotional stakes become so high that the smallest approval feels like victory, the smallest disapproval like devastation. You begin to attach your self-worth to their reactions, to interpret your value based on how they treat you in any given moment. And because their behavior is inconsistent, sometimes cruel, sometimes kind, your brain becomes hyper-focused on tracking every shift, every sign, every word. Because if you can anticipate the storm, maybe you can prevent it, maybe you can manage it, maybe you can keep the peace. And in doing so, you turn yourself into someone who is constantly adapting, constantly scanning, constantly negotiating your own needs in order to meet theirs. This is not love, but your body may not know the difference, because trauma bonding doesn't feel like pain all the time. It feels like a roller coaster, like highs and lows so intense they become addictive, like emotional whiplash disguised as passion, like someone holding you after they push you, wiping your tears after they cause them. And because the care feels genuine, even if it's fleeting, even if it only comes after harm, you begin to hold on to it, to believe in it, to hope for more of it. And that hope is what keeps you stuck, because every time they show you softness, your brain wants to believe that this, not the pain, is who they truly are. And maybe it is in moments, but moments are not patterns, and love is not proven by how good someone can be after being cruel. It is proven by how consistently they choose not to be cruel at all. But in trauma bonds, the inconsistency is the bond, the unpredictability is the hook, because intermittent reinforcement, the unpredictable cycle of reward and punishment, is one of the most powerful behavioral conditioning tools in existence. It's how casinos keep people gambling, how abusers keep people attached, and how emotional dependency grows not in peace, but in chaos. You may find yourself defending them, minimizing the harm, focusing on the good times, telling yourself that no one is perfect, that everyone has flaws, that you've made mistakes too, and maybe you have, but mistakes are not the same as manipulation. Flaws are not the same as harm, and love is not supposed to feel like walking through a minefield hoping today is a good day, hoping your smile is enough, hoping your silence will keep the peace. The longer the bond continues, the harder it becomes to leave, not just because of fear, but because of confusion, because you've been trained to believe that their love, when it appears, is real, and that you are the one who has to earn it, that if you leave, you'll be giving up on someone who sometimes shows you the person you fell for, or the parent you need, or the friend you remember, and you convince yourself that if you just stay a little longer, be a little better, they will become that version permanently. But they won't, not because they're incapable of kindness, but because the cycle itself is what maintains their control. Because if they were only cruel, you would leave, and if they were only kind, you would grow, but in the mix, in the imbalance, in the not knowing, that's where your emotional leash is created, and it tightens every time you question whether what you feel is valid, whether your pain is real, whether you are allowed to want more without being called selfish, dramatic, or disloyal. Trauma bonding isolates you from your own clarity. It makes you distrust your instincts, question your memory, second-guess your reactions, because when the person who hurts you also comforts you, your nervous system becomes confused, your heart becomes conflicted, and your brain begins to blur the lines between attachment and fear, between love and survival, between devotion and dependence. And often the people around you don't understand. They ask why you stay, they tell you to leave, they point out the obvious and you hear them, but it doesn't land, not because you don't see the truth, but because your nervous system doesn't feel safe enough to act on it. Because the idea of leaving feels more terrifying than staying, not because you want to suffer, but because you've been conditioned to believe that the suffering is part of the love, and if you walk away from one, you walk away from the other. You are not weak for staying, you are not broken for believing, you are not foolish for hoping, you are bonded through a system that your body has come to rely on for emotional regulation, even if it costs you peace. And until you find a new way to feel safe, to feel seen, to feel valued, the bond will remain not because it's good for you, but because it's familiar, and familiarity, especially in trauma, often feels like love when it's just repetition. Healing begins when you start to name the pattern, not just the pain, when you recognize that affection given after harm is not affection. It's a strategy, that apologies without behavior change are not progress, they're resets, that your desire for connection is valid, but that connection built on pain is not the kind you deserve, and that love is not something you have to survive in order to receive. It's hard because walking away doesn't feel like freedom at first. It feels like loss, like guilt, like abandoning someone who needs you, like betraying a bond that felt real. And in many ways it was real, but real doesn't always mean healthy. Intense doesn't always mean meaningful, and loyalty doesn't always mean love. Trauma bonding breaks you slowly, by making you believe you are growing stronger when you are actually growing smaller, by making you believe that enduring harm is a sign of devotion, by making you believe that leaving is failure, when it is actually the beginning of self-respect. You may need time, you may need help, you may relapse emotionally, you may miss them, not because they were good to you, but because they were part of you, because their validation became your reward, their moods your weather, their attention your drug, and breaking the bond is not just about walking away. It's about building a new self that no longer needs to be in pain to feel alive. Trauma bonding isn't love, it's emotional captivity dressed in hope. It's confusion disguised as closeness. It's survival masquerading as romance. And when you see it clearly, when you name it without excuses, without shame, without apology, you give yourself the permission to choose something else, not because you're angry, not because you want revenge, but because you finally understand that love should not feel like a storm you're grateful to survive. It should feel like peace that doesn't make you blood. You are a child, you don't yet know what normal looks like, because your entire sense of the world is shaped by the hands that feed you, protect you, and speak for you. And those same hands also carry your body into hospitals, describe your symptoms in detail, explain your mysterious illness to doctors, and whisper to nurses that you have always been fragile, that there's always something wrong, that your body is a delicate thing that breaks in invisible ways, but none of it feels wrong to you. Because this is the only version of care you've ever known. Sometimes you believe you really are sick, because your caretaker says so with such confidence, such emotional weight, and they cry at your bedside, hold your hand tightly, and tell everyone how brave you are, how strong you are, how much they worry about you, how much they sacrifice to take care of you, and the way they look at you not just when you're weak, but especially when you're weak feels almost like love, like their affection depends on your pain, like your vulnerability is the ticket to their tenderness. This is the essence of caregiver syndrome, a psychological pattern where someone, often a parent or guardian, fabricates or exaggerates the illness of another, usually a child, in order to receive attention, sympathy, or validation from others, not by directly claiming to be sick themselves, but by casting themselves as the devoted caretaker, the selfless protector, the tragic hero who gives everything for the person who is always in need, and in this dynamic. The sick person is not just a victim of deception, but a prop in a performance, a character in someone else's emotional story. You don't see it for what it is because your reality has been carefully constructed, emotionally reinforced, and socially validated by systems that are supposed to protect you, but are often too overwhelmed to question what they're being told. And when your caretaker talks to professionals, they do it with such precision, such intensity, that their version becomes the default, and your silence or your confusion only seems to confirm it. And slowly, the idea of being healthy becomes not just unfamiliar, but threatening, because health might mean distance, disconnection, even punishment, and so you learn to stay small, stay weak, stay dependent, because it is in your helplessness that you are loved. Imagine growing up in a home where every cough becomes a concern, every stomach ache a crisis, where you are taught to monitor your body not for comfort or awareness, but for flaws, for symptoms, for problems, and your identity becomes built around the idea that something is wrong with you, that your limits are hardwired, that your dreams are unrealistic, and your sense of self-worth is tied to how much someone else can sacrifice for you, how much they can protect you from a world they describe as dangerous, uncaring, or too harsh for someone like you. And when you try to step away from that identity, when you try to be independent, to be confident, to take risks or speak for yourself, there's resistance, subtle at first, maybe a guilt trip, a reminder that they worry, that they don't sleep when you're gone, that they know you better than you know yourself. But if you persist, the resistance grows sharper, maybe it turns into anger, into sabotage, into emotional withdrawal, and you start to understand the unwritten rule. You are safest when you are sick, you are loved when you are limited, you are seen when you are broken. This dynamic is not just painful, it is deeply confusing because your caretaker doesn't look like a villain. They don't scream or hit or lock you away. They comfort you, they bring you warm food and warm blankets, they sit by your side in hospital rooms, they speak softly and smile sadly and tell you that they would do anything to make you better. And maybe they believe it, maybe a part of them truly wants you to heal, just not all the way, not to the point where you no longer need them. Not to the point where you leave the script they've written for you, and that contradiction becomes the emotional cage. They love you, but only when you suffer. As you grow older, the effects of this become more visible, more damaging, because even if the fabricated illnesses stop, the internalized belief remains, the belief that you are fragile, that you can't trust your body, that your instincts are wrong, that your feelings are dramatic, that your health is conditional, and that your independence is dangerous, and these beliefs don't fade with age, they evolve into patterns. Anxiety around doctors, fear of autonomy, guilt around success, and a lingering question in every relationship: will they still love me if I'm strong? Caregiver syndrome is not just a betrayal of trust. It is a rewriting of the self, a reshaping of your emotional reality, and even when you see it clearly, when you finally recognize that your pain was a tool, that your voice was quieted, that your story was hijacked, the healing is not immediate because the wound is in how you define love, how you receive attention, how you measure care, and those definitions were formed in a system that rewarded your suffering and punished your freedom. It is possible to unlearn this, but it takes time because at first, health doesn't feel good, it feels unsafe, it feels empty, it feels like abandonment because your body remembers that strength once led to silence, that confidence once led to withdrawal, that joy once led to distance. And so you may find yourself sabotaging progress, downplaying wellness, returning to pain not because you want to suffer, but because it's the only version of closeness you've ever known. And if you become a caregiver yourself, you may repeat the pattern, not by faking illness in others, but by over-identifying with their pain, by feeling needed only when someone else is struggling, by tying your self-worth to your role as a fixer, a rescuer, a martyr. And in doing so, you may unknowingly pass on the same confusion you were raised in, the belief that love equals sacrifice, that care equals control, that emotional connection requires someone to be broken. To heal from this syndrome is to redefine love not as attention earned through suffering, but as presence given freely, without condition, without reward, without dependence, and that requires rebuilding trust in your body, in your instincts, in your capacity to exist without being someone else's project, someone else's purpose, someone else's story. You are allowed to be healthy, even if it disappoints them. You are allowed to be whole, even if it feels unfamiliar. You are allowed to exist outside of someone else's need to save you. You are allowed to become the main character of your life, not the symbol of someone else's sacrifice. You see someone walk into the room and everything changes. The temperature, the silence, the way people hold themselves, the way they glance but don't stare, the way laughter softens and movements tighten. And though no one says it directly, you feel it, the weight of this person's presence, the sharpness of their words, the precision in their posture, and you are not the only one who notices. But something inside you reacts differently, not with fear or suspicion, but with fascination. Because this person carries something that others don't: control, power, dominance, and you can't look away. They don't need to shout, they don't need to smile, they don't even need to ask, because their existence demands obedience not through charm but through gravity, and the way they speak to others, curt, decisive, cold, should make you pull back, should signal danger, should trigger that quiet inner alarm that tells you to tread carefully, but instead it draws you in, it makes you curious, it makes you want to understand them, to be close to them, to impress them, and slowly. You find yourself justifying their behavior, excusing their cruelty, redefining their violence as strength, their detachment as mystery, their control as passion. This is the beginning of a psychological phenomenon sometimes referred to as dangerous attraction to power, a pattern in which individuals, often unconsciously, find themselves romantically or emotionally drawn to figures who exhibit dominance, aggression, or even criminality. And while the term hybristophilia is used clinically to describe sexual arousal from partners who commit violent crimes, this broader version includes a wider spectrum, from attraction to authoritarian personalities, to obsession with leaders, to falling in love with someone who frightens you, not in spite of that fear, but because of it. You might not call it that, of course, you might describe it as admiration, intensity, charisma, magnetism, and in many cases it begins with a backstory. They had a hard life, they're misunderstood, they had to become hard to survive, and they only show their softness to you, and that belief, that illusion of unique access creates the bond. It makes you feel special, chosen, as if you alone can reach the core beneath their armor, as if your love can change them, calm them, save them. But the pattern is deeper than personal history. It's built into emotional wiring and sometimes into trauma. Because for those raised around fear, unpredictability, or control, power can feel familiar, even comforting, and the body, trained by survival, may confuse intensity for intimacy, danger for depth, dominance for devotion. And so when someone triggers that same chemical cocktail of anxiety and awe, it doesn't feel wrong, it feels right, it feels like home. Even if that home was built on fear. The paradox of this syndrome is that the more unsafe someone is to others, the more alluring they may become to those caught in this loop, not because they are blind to the risk, but because risk itself becomes the proof of significance. If they're dangerous and they choose you, that must mean something, that must mean you're important, strong enough to stand beside them, wise enough to understand them, worthy of their focus in a world they dominate. In more extreme cases, this attraction crosses into public obsession. Individuals writing love letters to murderers, defending war criminals, idolizing authoritarian leaders, not because of what they've done, but because of how untouchable they seem, how above the rules, how unbothered by morality, and that untouchability becomes intoxicating to those who feel powerless, invisible, or ignored, because aligning with someone feared can feel like protection, like validation, like a shortcut to significance. But even outside the extremes, this dynamic plays out in quiet relationships, in people who stay with partners who control them, who belittle them, who threaten them. And when asked why they stay, the answers sound rational. They're just intense, they've had a hard past, they don't mean to hurt me, and underneath those explanations lies a deeper truth. That power, even when it hurts, still feels more bearable than being alone, than being invisible, than feeling like no one strong will ever choose you. This syndrome feeds on emotional confusion, especially when power is paired with moments of vulnerability. The partner who screams at you, then cries and apologizes, the leader who humiliates others but praises you privately, the figure who crushes boundaries, then says you're the only one who truly sees them, and that confusion creates a loop. Hurt, then hope, fear, then reassurance, punishment, then reward, and your brain, craving consistency, clings to the reward, ignores the rest, and starts to chase the moments when they're kind, as if your loyalty is a test and love is the prize. Over time, this creates dependency, not just emotional but chemical. Your nervous system learns to expect the highs and lows. Your body begins to crave the adrenaline of chaos, and normal, healthy, balanced relationships feel dull, feel fake, feel insufficient, because they don't trigger the same rush, the same urgency, the same emotional whiplash. And so, without realizing it, you may sabotage peace, reject calm, and run back to danger, not because you love pain, but because pain has always been packaged with attention, with meaning, with closeness. Dangerous attraction to power is not stupidity. It's not weakness. It's a response to internal mapping, to emotional history, to systems that taught you early on that love is earned through endurance, that being desired means being dominated, that safety is less important than feeling chosen. And the people caught in this cycle are not naive. They are often deeply aware of the risk, but awareness alone doesn't break the bond, because the bond is not built in the mind, it's built in the nervous system, in the layers of identity shaped by past survival. Breaking this pattern requires more than recognition. It requires reconditioning, teaching your body that calm is not the same as neglect, that softness is not the same as weakness, that being respected is not boring, and that love does not need to scare you in order to be real. And that process is slow, sometimes painful, because it feels like walking away from the most intense connection you've ever had, even if that connection was built on harm. The danger of this syndrome is not just in who you choose, but in who you become, because the more time you spend around power that controls, the more you adjust yourself to survive it, to please it, to mirror it, and one day, you may find yourself behaving in ways you once swore you never would, just to keep the bond alive, to avoid being discarded, to stay close to someone who makes you feel significant through fear. But love that depends on fear is not love, it's survival dressed as romance. And significance that comes from being close to danger is not strength, it's proximity to a fire that will eventually burn through whatever you've built. You are allowed to want intensity, to crave depth, to long for connection that moves you, but not at the cost of yourself, not at the cost of your voice, your peace, your freedom. Real power is not the ability to control others, it's the ability to stay kind in a world that rewards cruelty, and real love is not what makes you smaller, quieter, or more afraid. It's what makes you more of who you are, without fear of punishment. You are not a magnet for danger, you are not defined by what you've survived, and you are not unlovable without the chaos. You can walk away from what once thrilled you, and it won't mean you're weak. It will mean you've grown strong enough to stop mistaking fire for warmth. You don't remember when exactly the line between reality and imagination started to blur, because it didn't happen all at once. It happened slowly, quietly, through conversations that felt honest, through feelings that felt true, through trust that felt earned. And by the time it began to matter, by the time it began to shape the way you saw the world, you were no longer thinking alone, because someone else was thinking with you, seeing with you, believing with you, and that shared belief felt more solid than any fact. More convincing than any evidence, more intimate than any secret, because it was just between the two of you. At first, it was just a thought, something small, maybe a suspicion about someone's intentions, or a sense that something wasn't right, maybe a strange coincidence you both noticed, a pattern only you two seemed to see, and when you shared it, their reaction wasn't skeptical. It was affirming, validating, like they already knew, like they'd been waiting for someone to say it out loud. And in that moment, something clicked, a connection deeper than logic, a bond rooted not in the external world, but in a private universe where everything made sense as long as you both agreed. This is the quiet seed of what psychologists call shared delusional belief, historically known by its French term folie à deux, which translates to madness of two, a rare but powerful psychological phenomenon where a delusional belief is transmitted from one person to another, usually in a close relationship marked by emotional dependence, and the belief, once adopted by both, becomes a shared reality, immune to outside reasoning, resistant to contradiction, and often reinforced by the emotional intensity of the relationship itself. You don't set out to lose touch with reality, no one does, but when trust becomes stronger than doubt, when emotional safety depends on shared perception, when love or loyalty or fear is tied to agreement, then reality becomes negotiable, flexible, even optional, and in such an environment one person's delusion, be it paranoia, conspiracy, grandiosity, or persecution, doesn't just echo into the mind of the other, it takes root, it grows, it becomes a system of meaning. In most cases, one person is the originator, often more dominant, charismatic, or emotionally intense, and the other, more dependent, more suggestible, more eager to connect, gradually adopts the belief not through manipulation alone, but through the desire to belong, to be close, to stay in sync, and the belief itself, no matter how irrational from the outside, begins to function as a glue, a story that explains everything, a shared lens through which the world is now interpreted. Maybe it starts with an idea that someone is out to get you, a neighbor, a coworker, a relative, and at first you're unsure, maybe even skeptical. But then the other person presents their evidence, their version of events, their feelings, and you begin to see what they see, not because it's logical, but because it fits into a narrative that makes emotional sense. And once you accept that frame, every new event, every glance, every silence seems to confirm the story, and now you're not just believing. You're protecting each other from the people who don't believe. This syndrome is not confined to mental illness in the clinical sense, because shared belief systems, especially extreme ones, can develop even among people with otherwise stable psychological profiles, especially when isolated, emotionally enmeshed, or exposed to environments that reward distrust and intensity over reason and nuance. And it becomes more dangerous when the belief includes fear, threat, or sense of mission, because then it's not just an idea, it's a duty, a defense. A battle that only the two of you understand. In some cases, it becomes romantic, a couple convinced that their love is being sabotaged by outsiders, that their connection is persecuted, cosmic, fragile, and therefore needs protection from the rest of the world. And this narrative, while appearing beautiful or passionate, becomes a cage, because every disagreement is now framed as betrayal, every doubt as disloyalty. And soon, the only way to prove love is to believe harder, to reject everyone else. To isolate together in a psychological bunker of shared certainty. In others, it becomes familial, a parent and child who become convinced of an invisible illness, a persecution by doctors, a conspiracy at school, and slowly the child no longer trusts their own experiences, because the parent's version is louder, more emotional, more persistent, and so their inner compass begins to shift, not towards truth, but towards attachment, because safety lies in agreement, and disagreement risks rejection. And in the age of information overload, it can also happen online, where people in echo chambers reinforce each other's fears, amplify each other's suspicions, and create virtual bonds based not on mutual understanding, but on mutual distrust of outsiders, and this can spiral quickly, especially when algorithms reward emotional intensity and confirmation bias. And suddenly, what started as a question becomes a conviction, a movement, a shared identity, us versus them. What makes shared delusional belief so difficult to disrupt is that it is relational. The belief is not just about facts, it's about trust, about loyalty, about emotional safety. And so when someone from the outside questions the belief, they are not just challenging an idea, they are challenging a relationship, and the response is often defensive, angry, or dismissive, because the belief is now serving a deeper function. It is protecting a bond that may feel like the only source of understanding in a hostile or confusing world. But like all delusions, it has a cost. Over time, it isolates, it distorts, it erodes the ability to test reality, to engage with complexity, to tolerate ambiguity, and those inside the bubble often become more anxious, more rigid, more desperate to preserve the belief. Because to let it go would mean not just admitting error, but facing emotional loss, identity confusion, and the fear that the connection wasn't real without it. Healing from this syndrome, when it becomes destructive, is not just about confronting the belief. It's about rebuilding emotional independence, reestablishing critical thinking, and most importantly, learning to trust connection without needing total agreement. And that's hard, especially for those who have experienced abandonment, betrayal, or emotional neglect, because the idea of having someone completely on your side, even at the cost of truth, can feel safer than being alone in uncertainty. But real connection doesn't require delusion, and real closeness doesn't require shared fantasy. It requires the courage to think together, not identically, to question without fear of rejection, to disagree without loss of love, and that kind of connection is more durable, more honest, and more free. You don't have to give up closeness to gain clarity. You don't have to lose love to regain your mind. And you don't have to protect someone's belief to prove your loyalty. You can protect their dignity instead, by believing in their capacity to think, to grow, to choose something better than a world made entirely of shadows. You're scrolling late at night, your phone glowing in the dark, and you see them again, their face, their smile, their words in a caption that feel like they're speaking only to you. And for a moment, the world narrows not into obsession, not even into fantasy, but into something more subtle and more powerful. Quiet conviction that this person, though distant, though famous, though surrounded by millions, would understand you in a way no one else does. That if they only knew you, met you, saw you, something real would happen. Not because you're delusional, but because it just feels true. It begins harmlessly, almost playfully. You follow their posts, you notice their expressions, you read between their words, and your mind starts to connect dots that no one else seems to see. Maybe they like to comment similar to yours, maybe they wear something that reflects your taste, maybe they share thoughts that mirror your own, and these little coincidences start to form a pattern, not just of admiration, but of alignment, as if there's a hidden thread tying your lives together. A signal that you're meant to matter to them. This psychological effect, often referred to clinically as erotomania, but here more clearly called celebrity illusion syndrome, is not about stalking or obsession in its extreme forms, but about a more common, socially normalized pattern where parasocial relationships, one-sided emotional connections with public figures, quietly evolve into personal narratives, internalized beliefs that the connection is mutual, or could be if only the distance were removed. You don't talk about it openly because to say it out loud makes it sound foolish, as if you've lost grip of reality, but in your mind it's not about fantasy, it's about recognition, about feeling seen by someone you've never met, someone whose image fills your feed, whose voice narrates your thoughts, whose presence becomes part of your emotional landscape, not as an unreachable idol, but as a silent companion who gets you, who inspires you, who might, in another life, have loved you. The human brain is wired for connection, and when it receives repeated exposure to a face, a voice, a name, it begins to form familiarity, the same way it does with people in your life. Even if that connection is unidirectional, even if the other person doesn't know you exist, your emotional system doesn't draw that distinction clearly. And so it responds with warmth, trust, even longing, because repetition, vulnerability, and perceived similarity trigger the same circuits as intimacy. And when you're in a state of loneliness or emotional disconnection, or simply searching for something that feels meaningful, these parasocial bonds grow stronger because they offer consistency. This person always shows up, always has something to say, always looks at the camera like they see you, and your mind, craving comfort, begins to assign weight to those moments, to imagine responses, to fill in the silence between their posts with dialogue you never had. It doesn't mean you're unstable or mentally ill. Millions of people experience versions of this, especially in a world where fame is not distant and sacred anymore, but intimate and daily, where celebrities invite you into their homes, show you their thoughts, share their routines, and create the illusion that you are part of their inner circle. And for someone longing to feel chosen, this illusion becomes emotionally real. But the risk begins when that illusion becomes identity-defining, when your sense of self-worth starts to depend on the idea that this person could love you, would love you if only circumstances allowed it, when you begin to filter your choices, your thoughts, even your appearance, through the imagined preferences of someone who doesn't know you exist, and slowly your real relationships begin to pale in comparison. Your expectations rise, your standards twist around an invisible figure. And you begin to chase a connection that only exists in your mind. In more extreme cases, this belief hardens not just a wish or a daydream, but a conviction that the celebrity is sending you messages, communicating through symbols, lyrics, glances that their silence is proof of their fear, that their relationships are covers, that you are the only one who truly sees them, and the belief persists even when confronted with contradictory evidence, because it's no longer just about them, it's about your need to believe to feel special. To escape the loneliness that reality sometimes brings. And the world around you doesn't always help. Reality shows, fan culture, direct access through comments and likes, even media speculation. All of it blurs the line between public and private and makes it easier for your mind to slip into a story where the walls between your life and theirs don't really exist, where your attention is not just one of millions, but unique, fated, deserved. But this illusion carries a cost. It creates a quiet ache, a longing that never resolves, a standard no one around you can meet, a comparison that leaves real people feeling inadequate, and over time it feeds dissatisfaction, emotional distance, and even self-neglect, because you begin to believe that your real life is just a waiting room for a connection that may never arrive. The emotional mechanism behind this syndrome is rooted in projection. When you idealize someone from afar, what you're really doing is projecting your own best qualities, your dreams, your values, your unmet needs onto them and falling in love not with who they are, but with who you become in their imagined presence, confident, seen, wanted enough. And so the relationship, though fictional, feels deeply real, because it reflects the self you most want to be. The tragedy of celebrity illusion syndrome is not in the belief itself, but in what it replaces: the friendships you could be building, the love you could be exploring, the self you could be developing outside of comparison. And the truth is, the version of yourself that believes you're lovable from afar is the same version who is lovable up close, in real life, in messy, imperfect, mutual relationships that don't require imagination, only courage. You don't need someone on a screen to validate your worth. You don't need to be chosen by someone famous to feel special. And you don't need to lose yourself in someone else's story in order to write your own. You are not invisible. You are not just another fan. And the version of love you're longing for, one that sees you, understands you, respects you, is possible, not in a fantasy, not in a headline, not in a follow-back, but in the quiet, patient, brave work of showing up fully for the life you already have. You wake up one morning and something feels off, not wrong exactly, but unfamiliar, as if the air in the room carries a different weight, the light has a slightly strange tone, or the silence doesn't quite sound like the one you're used to. And then you see them, the person you've seen 1,000 times before, maybe a parent, a partner, a sibling, but this time, something inside you hesitates, recoils, not in fear, but in confusion, because everything about them looks exactly the same. But your mind tells you they are not who they appear to be. You study their face, their movements, their voice, and logically nothing has changed. Their smile is the same, their habits familiar, their memories consistent. Yet there's a hollowness behind their presence, a missing emotional signal, a disruption in the deep sense of knowing that usually comes from being with someone close, and your brain, unable to explain the gap between recognition and feeling, starts to generate its own story, a terrifying one: that this person is an imposter, a perfect copy. Someone pretending to be your loved one. This phenomenon is known as Caregiver Syndrome, but here we will refer to it as identity replacement delusion, a rare but deeply disturbing psychological condition in which the person affected becomes convinced that someone they know, usually someone emotionally close, has been replaced by an identical-looking double. And although it sounds like something from science fiction or a thriller, it is in fact a well-documented neurological and psychiatric disturbance, grounded in how the human brain processes recognition and emotion together. To understand how this happens, imagine that the brain has two separate systems for recognizing people, one that processes their visual appearance, and another that connects that appearance to emotional familiarity. And in a healthy mind, these two systems work together seamlessly. So when you see someone you love, you not only know who they are, but you feel that they are familiar, safe, part of your life. But in identity replacement delusion, the second part malfunctions. The emotional confirmation fails to register, and the result is a surreal disconnection. You see their face but feel nothing, and the mind, unable to reconcile this mismatch, invents an explanation. And the explanation, though irrational, follows a strange internal logic. If this person looks exactly like someone I know but doesn't feel like them, then the most plausible reason must be that they are a replica, a fraud, a replacement. And once this belief forms, it resists contradiction, because everything that should disprove it, their memories, their kindness, their words, now seem like further proof of the deception, as if the imposter has studied the real person, learned their mannerisms, practiced their voice, all to maintain the illusion. This delusion is not born from lack of intelligence or imagination, but from a profound breakdown in the brain's emotional circuitry, often associated with brain injury, dementia, or certain psychotic disorders, particularly when the pathways between the visual cortex and the limbic system, the area responsible for emotional processing, are disrupted, and without that emotional ping of familiarity, recognition alone becomes suspicious. As if the body recognizes the person, but the soul does not. What makes this syndrome especially heartbreaking is that it often targets the people closest to the affected individual, which means the very relationships that should bring comfort now bring fear, mistrust, or even hostility, and the person experiencing the delusion may become paranoid, withdrawn, or even aggressive, not because they have stopped caring, but because they no longer believe the person they care about is truly there. Imagine what that must feel like, to live in a world where the people who claim to love you are imposters, where your own memories are being weaponized against you, where every hug feels like a trap, every conversation like a performance, And in that mental reality, you are alone, surrounded not by strangers, but by perfectly disguised replacements who insist they are real, and the more they insist, the more suspicious it feels. And now imagine being the loved one on the other side, waking up to find that your mother or son or spouse looks at you with quiet suspicion, insists you're someone else, accuses you of deception, and no matter what you say or do, their mind will not let you back in because it has rewritten your place in their reality, and the more you plead, the more deeply they believe you're faking it, and the pain of that loss, of being physically present but emotionally erased, is unlike anything else. In some cases, the delusion can expand, not just one person, but multiple people are seen as replaced, or even animals, objects, familiar locations, as if the world itself has been subtly swapped out and the person experiencing this may live in a state of constant doubt, suspicion, and disorientation, unable to trust the very fabric of their environment, and this leads to profound isolation, anxiety, and in many cases, a refusal to engage with those they once loved, because the emotional map that once grounded their relationships has been erased. It's important to understand that this syndrome is not a choice, not a belief someone adopts out of whim or fantasy. It is a neurological failure, a disconnect between what the eyes see and what the heart knows, and it reveals something fundamental about how fragile human connection is, how much of our reality depends not just on information, but on feeling, on emotional resonance, on the invisible bridge between perception and trust. Treatment for identity replacement delusion is complex, often involving antipsychotic medication, cognitive therapy, and in some cases, family involvement to manage the emotional toll on both sides, but recovery is possible, especially when the underlying neurological cause is addressed, and the brain begins to reintegrate emotional responses into recognition, allowing the person to once again feel what they see, to know not just who someone is, but that they are real. But even outside of clinical delusion, this syndrome touches on a deeper human fear, the fear that the people we love might change, or become strangers, or no longer feel familiar. And in a more symbolic sense, many people have experienced moments where someone they know deeply suddenly feels distant, where the emotional bond weakens and the person, though present, feels foreign, and though this isn't Capgras syndrome, it echoes the same unsettling sense that recognition alone is not enough to sustain closeness. Human relationships are not just built on facts, they are built on felt presence, on emotional resonance, on the tiny signals that tell us we are known, loved, and safe. And when those signals are missing, even for reasons we can't explain, the mind begins to drift to doubt, to fear, and in that space, reality itself becomes uncertain. You may never experience identity replacement delusion in its clinical form, but you might understand the quiet horror of looking at someone you once loved and feeling distance, or seeing their face and wondering where the connection went. And in those moments, you're touching the edge of what this syndrome reveals, that recognition without emotion is not enough, and that to truly know someone, we must feel them, not just see them. So when you look into the eyes of someone you love, and you feel that warmth, that click, that familiarity, remember how precious that is, how easily it can be disrupted, and how much of our sense of reality depends not on sight alone, but on what the heart quietly confirms without needing words. You wake up and something is missing, not from your room, not from your routine, but from you, a sense that something essential inside has gone silent, like a switch has been flipped somewhere deep and untraceable. And though your body moves and breathes and reacts, a quiet part of you whispers that you're no longer alive, not metaphorically, not poetically, but literally, as if you've crossed some invisible line and what remains is an echo, a shell, a ghost that looks like you but isn't truly there. You eat, but the food tastes like nothing, not because of flavor or appetite, but because you're convinced your stomach no longer functions, that your organs have stopped, that your blood has drained or turned to dust, that your heart continues to beat only because no one has noticed it shouldn't, and every breath feels like theater. Every step like a lie your body tells the world, while your mind insists the truth is something darker. This is the terrifying experience of what psychiatry calls Cotard's syndrome, but more accessibly described here as the walking corpse belief, a rare and extreme psychological condition in which a person becomes convinced that they are dead, or that parts of their body no longer exist, or that they are hollow, empty, decomposing from the inside despite all evidence to the contrary. And while this sounds impossible, it is as real to those who suffer it as any waking thought, and more persistent than any nightmare. It is not a metaphor for depression, though depression often walks alongside it. It is not a feeling of numbness or sadness alone, but a cognitive delusion, a fixed belief that life has ended or disappeared from within, even if the world continues around you. And for those who experience it, the horror is not in dying, but in remaining in a body they no longer believe belongs to them, among people who insist they're alive, while every thought, every sensation, every reflection says otherwise. Imagine what it would feel like to walk into a room and believe you do not exist in it, to touch your skin and be certain that it's decaying, to hear your voice and think it belongs to a ghost, not in a dreamy or dissociative way, but in the cold, unshakable conviction that life has left you and no one has noticed, and worse, that no one can help because what you're missing is not a wound that can be healed, but a soul that has already gone. This syndrome often emerges from a combination of severe depression, psychotic episodes, or neurological trauma, and is associated with damage to the brain areas responsible for emotional processing and self-perception, particularly in the parietal lobe and the limbic system. And when these systems fail to communicate correctly, the result is a catastrophic collapse in the sense of being alive, not just emotionally, but ontologically, as in the very belief that you are a living being. What's most haunting is how rational the thought can seem from the inside. You might look in the mirror and see a face, but feel no connection to it. Your voice may sound foreign, your memories feel borrowed, your sensations dull or fake, and your mind, trying to make sense of these disconnects, concludes the only explanation is that you must be dead, that this is some kind of purgatory, or that your body is moving on autopilot while your essence is already gone. In some documented cases, people with Cotard S have refused to eat because they believed they had no stomach, or insisted they could not sleep because their brain no longer functioned, or even asked to be buried because they were certain that what remained of them should not walk among the living. And though this seems unimaginable, the internal logic feels airtight to the person living inside it. If I feel nothing, if I see no color, if I recognize no self, then I must already be gone. From the outside, it is deeply distressing to witness a loved one who insists they no longer exist, who speaks of death not as a wish but as a fact, who denies their body, their voice, their identity, and yet speaks clearly, responds to questions, walks through the world while insisting they are absent from it. And caregivers, doctors, even family members often find themselves powerless, because no amount of reassurance can override a belief so deeply embedded in the structure of perception itself. The emotional cost is enormous. For the individual, it means a complete rupture in the relationship with the self, a detachment from agency, a loss of purpose, because how do you make plans, feel joy, ask for help when you don't believe you exist in the first place? And for those around them, it means trying to love someone who insists they are gone, trying to connect with someone who sees your concern as misplaced, your affection as misdirected toward a body without a soul. But beneath the delusion lies something deeply human, a desperate attempt to explain unbearable emotional pain, a brain thought. When overwhelmed by trauma, depression, or disconnection, rewrites reality not to escape it, but to make sense of the numbness, the detachment, the loss of self that cannot be named in ordinary terms, and in that sense, the walking corpse belief is not madness in the traditional sense, but a narrative, a dark, tragic narrative, the mind tells to make meaning out of silence. Treatment for Cotard syndrome is possible, though difficult, and often requires a combination of antipsychotic medications, antidepressants, and in some cases, electroconvulsive therapy, which, despite its controversial reputation, has shown effectiveness in restoring emotional function and breaking the grip of the delusion. And as the brain begins to reconnect its emotional signals, the person may slowly return to the sense of being alive, not just in thought, but in experience. Recovery is not always linear. For some, the belief fades like fog lifting. For others, it clings like a shadow, retreating only to return. And for many, the memory of having believed they were dead lingers as a trauma in itself, a reminder of how thin the line between perception and reality can be, and how easily the mind, when stripped of emotional feedback, rewrites the most basic truths of existence. You may never experience Cotard syndrome, but perhaps you felt echoes of it, moments of deep emotional numbness, times when your reflection looked foreign, when your voice didn't sound like yours, when the world felt distant, not hostile, but irrelevant. And in those moments, you brushed against the edge of what this syndrome magnifies, the terrifying fragility of the self. The way being alive is not just about breathing or thinking, but about feeling present, feeling real. Feeling like you are still here. So if you ever find yourself drifting into detachment, if the world grows dull and your self begins to fade, remember that aliveness is not something you have to feel all the time to still possess it, that the absence of joy does not mean the absence of being, and that even in silence, in stillness, in numbness, you remain, perhaps wounded, perhaps lost, but not gone. And if someone you love ever looks at you and says they are no longer alive, listen not with logic, but with compassion, not with arguments, but with presence, because what they need is not proof of life, but proof of connection. The one thing that delusions, no matter how powerful, can never fully erase. You're walking alone through a quiet museum, and suddenly you stop in front of something that doesn't just catch your eye, it holds you completely, in a way that people often describe about first love or spiritual experiences. And as you stand there looking at this object, maybe it's an old piece of architecture, a machine, a monument, or a well-designed sculpture, something happens inside you, something calm but powerful, like your thoughts just settled around it naturally. As if the object knows something you don't, and being near it makes you feel safe, understood, almost seen. You might think this is admiration or aesthetic appreciation, but for some people, this kind of connection isn't casual or symbolic. It becomes emotional, intimate, and in some rare but very real cases, romantic or deeply personal, where the object becomes the central focus of their affection, comfort, or even love. And this is what psychology refers to as objectophilia, although in this script we'll explore it through the softened lens of attachment to objects, which allows us to understand the emotional mechanisms behind it without judgment or sensationalism. This phenomenon isn't about someone being confused or delusional or lacking social connection. It is often structured around real feelings of safety, familiarity, control, and even identity, and the object in question is not seen as a placeholder for a person, but as something worthy of love and connection in its own right. And for the person experiencing it, the object may represent stability in a world that feels unstable. Loyalty in a life where human relationships have often disappointed, or meaning in a reality that can feel random and impersonal. To understand this more clearly, imagine a child who grows up feeling unsafe. Maybe there's chaos at home, instability in their environment, or emotional inconsistency in their caregivers. And during this time, they find comfort in a specific object. A toy, a blanket, a piece of furniture, something solid, unchanging, and always there. And slowly, the brain learns to associate this object with relief, security, predictability, and those associations don't disappear with age, they deepen, and sometimes they grow. As adulthood arrives, the attachment can shift, especially if emotional needs continue to go unmet. Some people develop a strong bond with their car or a building or a piece of industrial design, and while this might look strange from the outside, internally it feels calm, consistent, and deeply rewarding, because the object does betray, it doesn't confuse, and it doesn't leave, it simply remains, and that stillness, that presence, becomes a form of emotional anchoring. There are real-world cases that illustrate this, people who have publicly spoken about their relationships with landmarks, bridges, vehicles, or even fences. And while media often reduces these stories to oddities or punchlines, the psychology behind them is far more subtle, and in many ways quite relatable, because humans bond with things all the time. We name our cars, talk to our devices, keep heirlooms not for their material value but for the memories they carry, and none of this is seen as strange until the attachment becomes intense or replaces human connection. But that's the part we need to pause on. For some individuals, this attachment doesn't replace human connection. It is their connection, not because they are incapable of love, but because their experience of love, safety, and trust has been shaped in such a way that objects, which don't change, don't hurt, and don't judge, feel like the most trustworthy partners. And in many cases, the bond isn't even sexual or romantic, but purely emotional, spiritual, or protective. From a psychological standpoint, this can be seen through the lens of transference, projection, and emotional imprinting, where the brain, seeking safety and control, projects those needs onto something external, and once that projection is made, the object becomes a vessel, not a fantasy, but of real emotional investment, and breaking that bond can feel as traumatic as the end of a relationship, because for the person involved, it is a relationship, just one that follows a different set of rules. In therapy, professionals approach this with sensitivity, because the goal isn't to shame or pathologize, but to understand the emotional logic behind the attachment. And in some cases, it can reveal deep layers of emotional history, early neglect, trauma, or emotional abandonment, that explain why certain individuals feel more comfortable bonding with objects than with unpredictable, emotionally complex humans, and rather than treating this as a disorder in itself. Many clinicians see it as a signpost pointing to unmet needs that deserve attention. And it's worth mentioning that not all object attachments are unhealthy. In fact, some are stabilizing, comforting, and even healing, especially when the attachment helps the person feel safe in the world, organize their emotions, or create a sense of identity in an otherwise overwhelming life. The question becomes whether the attachment limits their ability to engage with the world, or whether it serves as a grounding mechanism that allows for greater participation in life. Culturally, we often dismiss or misunderstand these experiences because they don't fit the standard narrative of connection. And yet, when we look more closely, We find echoes of this pattern everywhere: collectors who speak of their items with reverence, architects who describe their buildings as friends, musicians who treat their instruments as extensions of the self, and even people who find emotional clarity through interacting with nature or specific environments. All showing that the line between object and connection is more porous than we admit. You may never fall in love with a monument or a machine, but you've probably felt something close: a favorite mug that makes your morning feel safe, a bench where you sat during a turning point in your life, a necklace that reminds you of someone gone, and in these moments the object is not just a thing, it's a vessel for memory, emotion, and meaning, and in that sense the attachment is very human. So next time you see someone deeply bonded to something physical, try to remember that the object may be carrying an invisible weight, the weight of years, of comfort, of unspoken emotion, and instead of wondering what's wrong with the attachment, ask what need it might be protecting, what wound it might be shielding, or what kind of stability it quietly provides in a world that so often fails to do the same. You're sitting at the edge of your bed after a long day, and all around you are the signals of adult life: the bills on the desk, the phone buzzing with work emails, the quiet pressure of responsibilities waiting to be handled. And yet, somewhere in the back of your mind, a part of you wishes it could all just stop. Not just the noise, not just the work, but the entire role you're supposed to play. And instead of pushing forward, that part of you wants to go backward. Back to a time before the world asked so much, before mistakes carried consequences, before every action felt heavy. At first, it's just a feeling, a desire for comfort, simplicity, warmth. Maybe it shows up when you curl up with a childhood blanket, or rewatch a cartoon you loved when you were 6, or eat a food that your parents used to make when you were sick. But for some people, that desire doesn't fade with nostalgia, it deepens into a full emotional pattern, one where they long to escape adult expectations and return, in a very real psychological sense, to an earlier emotional state. And this is what we refer to as regressive emotional fixation. This phenomenon involves a persistent pull toward earlier stages of emotional development, not as a game, not as fantasy, but as an internal coping mechanism, a way to feel safe, cared for, and unburdened in a world that feels too large, too cold, too complicated. And it is not about being immature or childish, but about finding refuge in simplicity, in softness, in dependency, because for many, those earlier emotional states feel like the only time they were truly protected. Imagine someone who, after facing years of instability, finds themselves emotionally retreating to a place where they no longer have to make decisions, where someone else is in charge, where being small and vulnerable isn't punished, but welcomed. In these mental spaces, regression isn't just a behavior, it's a language, a way the psyche expresses its need for care, structure, and emotional holding that it never received fully the first time around. This can manifest in a range of behaviors, from harmless rituals like watching children's shows, using baby talk in private, or collecting toys, to more immersive expressions where a person might role-play as a younger version of themselves in private moments. And while this can seem unusual to outsiders, the emotional logic is clear. It is an attempt to recreate or simulate the emotional security that was either lost or never fully given. What separates this from simple nostalgia is the intensity and repetition. The desire to return is not just occasional. It becomes central to how the person manages stress, anxiety, or disconnection, and it's often unconscious, meaning the person may not fully understand why they feel so drawn to these states. They just know that when the world becomes too much, this is where they emotionally go to feel whole again. From a psychological perspective, this is closely related to regression as a defense mechanism, a process in which the mind reverts to an earlier stage of development when faced with overwhelming stress. And while everyone experiences minor regression at times, like craving parental comfort when sick, in regressive emotional fixation, the pattern becomes stable, preferred, and sometimes essential for functioning. For example, a person with this pattern might struggle to maintain adult relationships, not because they lack intelligence or capacity, but because they feel safest when nurtured, when roles are clear, when someone else takes the lead. They may avoid conflict, resist change, and seek out dynamics where they can remain in a passive role, not because they are lazy, but because assertiveness was once punished, independence once hurt them, and dependency became survival. This fixation often traces back to childhood experiences of trauma, neglect, or unmet needs. Maybe their caregivers were inconsistent, or emotionally unavailable, or demanded adult-level behavior too early, and so the child learned that being small wasn't safe, or that love was conditional, or that care came only when one was helpless. And in adult life, the psyche attempts to recreate a corrected version of that childhood, one where the self is allowed to be soft, held, and unjudged. In therapy, this is approached with great care. The goal is never to shame the regression, but to understand what it protects, what it communicates, and how it can be honored without dominating the person's emotional world. And often, healing involves offering the adult self the same kind of gentle care and structure that the child's self never received, so that over time, the person doesn't have to flee backward to feel safe, because safety becomes available in the present. It's important to say that not all expressions of regression are unhealthy. Many people find healing and stress relief in reconnecting with their inner child through play, softening, SS, or even aesthetic choices. The issue only arises when the emotional return becomes compulsive, when it blocks development, or when the person begins to feel like they can't function in the adult world without escaping into these earlier roles. And culturally, this is often misunderstood. People laugh, ridicule, or pathologize adults who express regression, not realizing that behind every behavior is a story, behind every soft blanket and quiet voice is a history of unmet emotional needs. And for many, this fixation is not about weakness, but about a form of strength, the strength to survive without the tools they should have been given early on, the courage to find safety in whatever ways they could. You may have never experienced this fully, but perhaps you've felt pieces of it, in moments when you were sick and wished someone would just take care of everything. When the weight of the world felt too heavy and you wanted to be told everything would be okay, not with logic but with presence, and in those moments you weren't childish, you were human. And what regressive emotional fixation shows us is that sometimes, the most grown-up thing we can do is admit how much we needed and still need to be nurtured. So next time you see someone retreating into softness, don't rush to judge. Ask what part of them is trying to feel safe, what part of them never got to rest, and what it might mean to be met with gentleness instead of shame. You're standing in front of a mirror, looking at yourself not with vanity or admiration, but with a quiet and persistent sense that something isn't quite right. And it's not about your hairstyle or your weight or any surface-level insecurity. It's something deeper, something harder to explain, a dissonance between how your body exists and how your identity feels, a subtle but constant friction between the image you present and the way you experience yourself internally. As if a part of your physical form doesn't belong to you, or perhaps never really did. This isn't a fleeting discomfort. It's not a thought that comes and goes like passing doubt. It's something that stays, that follows you through your daily life like an invisible background noise. And while you function, while you interact, work, smile, and move through routines like everyone else, there's always a layer underneath, an awareness, a feeling of misalignment, where one specific part of your body feels foreign, intrusive, or even unnecessary. This experience, though rarely discussed openly, is real for some individuals, and psychology refers to this pattern in a softened and more accessible way as identity disruption disorder, a condition in which a person feels that a part of their own physical body is incompatible with their internal sense of self. And while this may sound confusing or extreme, it is in many ways a direct reflection of how deeply identity and embodiment are linked. Imagine waking up every morning feeling like something is out of place, not because of trauma or delusion, but because your sense of who you are does not fully match the physical form you inhabit, and no matter how much you try to ignore it, rationalize it, or adapt to it, the feeling returns, sometimes quiet, sometimes overwhelming, but always there, shaping how you move, how you relate to others, and how you think about your own future. This specific experience often involves a strong desire to remove or alter a part of the body, most commonly a limb, not because of pain or dysfunction, but because that part feels like an intruder, something extra, something that interrupts the coherence of the self. And while this may sound alarming to people unfamiliar with the condition, it is not about attention-seeking, self-harm, or a wish to suffer. It is about relief, about the possibility of finally feeling internally aligned. From a psychological standpoint, this condition is incredibly complex and not yet fully understood, but what is clear is that it is not caused by a lack of intelligence, nor by poor mental health in general, but by a very specific form of identity disturbance, one that likely originates in early developmental patterns where the brain's map of the body and the emotional sense of self diverged, creating a lifelong mismatch that no amount of social affirmation or physical health can easily correct. People who live with this often carry immense shame, not because they believe their feelings are wrong, but because the world offers them no framework to explain what they're going through. There are no common metaphors, no easy categories, and so they often suffer in silence, afraid to share what they feel even with therapists, fearing they'll be labeled or misunderstood, when all they truly want is for their body to make sense in the same way their mind does. And perhaps you felt a shadow of this, maybe not in the same form, but in that quiet inner disconnection that can come when you look at yourself and feel like you're wearing a costume, or when your voice sounds wrong to your ears, or when a photo of yourself feels like a stranger. These are glimpses into what it means to experience embodiment as something confusing, something that doesn't automatically bring comfort or familiarity. For people with identity disruption disorder, these feelings are not moments. They are the baseline, the default state, and trying to suppress them doesn't work, because the conflict isn't based in imagination. It's woven into the way their nervous system processes selfhood, and while some might try to reframe or reinterpret the experience, many come to the same internal conclusion: that the only way to feel whole is to reshape the body to match the mind. This raises complex ethical and medical questions, especially in fields like psychiatry, surgery, and identity rights, where professionals must balance compassion with caution. And while no single answer applies to all, what's becoming more accepted in modern psychological practice is the need to listen deeply, to validate the internal experiences of those who live with this condition, and to treat them not as anomalies, but as people navigating an identity terrain that happens to be shaped differently. Some individuals do pursue medical interventions, including surgeries, and report profound relief afterward, not because they wanted to be disabled, but because the removal of the unwanted part brought their identity into alignment, and suddenly the internal dissonance, the background hum of distress, was gone, replaced by a calm sense of ownership over the body that had never existed before. And while this path is not suitable or accessible for everyone, it shows that for some, the psychological wound is not healed by therapy alone, but by embodiment that matches their truth. Therapists who work with individuals experiencing identity disruption disorder often focus not on changing the desire, but on understanding it, where it comes from, what emotions surround it, what meaning it holds, and through that process, many clients report a greater sense of self-awareness, less shame, and sometimes alternative ways of engaging with their identity that reduce distress, even if the underlying mismatch remains. Importantly, not all people who experience this desire act on it. Many live full, functional lives while carrying the internal conflict, managing it through introspection, creative expression, or quiet rituals that allow them to feel more in control. And their choice not to seek physical change doesn't mean their feelings are less valid. It simply reflects the complexity of how identity and action are always mediated by context, risk, and personal values. And for those observing from the outside, family, friends, clinicians, the challenge is often learning to separate discomfort from judgment, to recognize that just because a condition feels alien or unsettling doesn't mean it's unreal, and that true empathy begins not with trying to fix or label, but with the humility to say, "I don't understand what you feel, but I believe that you do," which can be the beginning of trust and often the first step toward healing. Ultimately, identity disruption disorder reminds us that selfhood is not something simple or static. It's not just how we look, or what we say, or even who we love. It's the deep, private architecture of how we experience being alive in a body. And for some people, that architecture is built differently, not broken, not damaged, just different. And while that difference can be painful, especially in a world that expects uniformity, it can also become a place of deep insight, transformation, and eventually, peace. You're sitting alone at night, maybe it's been a long day, maybe nothing dramatic happened, but something inside you feels off, not broken exactly, but raw, like you're carrying an invisible weight that no one else sees, and instead of reaching out, instead of escaping it, you find yourself leaning in, replaying memories that hurt you, imagining conversations that never ended well, even seeking out songs, photos, or messages that you know will reopen the wound, and part of you knows this will make you feel worse. But another part, quietly, insists on staying in the pain. This isn't about self-pity or drama. It's not about wanting attention or exaggerating feelings. It's a real psychological pattern where pain becomes familiar, even strangely comforting, and in some people this pattern becomes so ingrained that pain itself becomes emotionally reinforcing, not because it feels good, but because it feels known, predictable, and in a strange way safe, because you already know how to survive it, because you've done it before. This phenomenon, which we're calling emotional reinforcement through pain, is not about masochism in a physical sense, nor about depression in a clinical one, though it can overlap with both. It's a very specific tendency where emotional suffering becomes self-sustaining, not because you want to hurt, but because pain becomes a structure, a way of organizing your feelings, a way to confirm something inside you that feels unresolved or abandoned. Imagine a child who grows up in a home where love was always mixed with distance, where comfort was rare, and attention only came when things went wrong. That child doesn't just learn that pain is present. They learn that pain is the context in which they are seen, held, or even validated, And so as they grow up, part of their brain associates hurt with attention, loneliness with truth, sadness with depth. And even when better experiences are available, they don't feel real, or worse, they feel undeserved. This leads to a strange internal contradiction. On the surface, a person may seek joy, connection, peace, but underneath, they may sabotage those very things, not out of malice, but because joy feels unstable, peace feels suspicious, and only pain feels emotionally honest. And so they return to it not because they want to suffer, but because suffering is what they believe they're meant to feel, what they trust, what they know how to carry. You might recognize this pattern in subtle ways. Maybe you push away good news because you're waiting for it to fall apart. Maybe you pick fights when things are going well because calm makes you anxious. Maybe you resist comfort because it feels fake, or because deep down you don't believe it will last. And while this might sound irrational, it makes perfect sense when seen through the lens of emotional learning. We don't just respond to what feels good, we respond to what feels familiar. In this way, pain becomes a kind of emotional gravity. It pulls you in when you're unmoored. It gives you something to hold when nothing else feels solid. And over time, you might even develop rituals around it, checking your ex's social media, rereading old arguments, listening to songs that remind you of loss, not because you enjoy it, but because these rituals confirm your narrative, your identity, the feeling that at least something is consistent. From a psychological perspective, this kind of self-reinforcing pain often arises when there's unresolved trauma, but not the loud, dramatic kind. Often it's the quiet kind, the kind where no one showed up, where your needs were invisible, where you weren't comforted when it mattered most, and that absence doesn't just vanish. It creates a space inside you that eventually gets filled with patterns. And if pain was the only emotion you were allowed to feel safely, then it becomes your default. One of the most difficult aspects of this pattern is that it resists healing, not consciously, but structurally. When something good begins to happen, it feels foreign, like a language you never learned to speak. And even if you want to trust it, your emotional system scans for danger, for the inevitable collapse, and sometimes you preemptively end it, just to avoid the crash, just to feel like you're in control. Because at least if you choose the pain, it's not being forced on you. You might even notice that compliments make you uncomfortable, that kindness makes you defensive, that being understood feels more frightening than being rejected. Because if someone really sees you and still leaves, that's unbearable. But if you push them away first, then you remain the one who knows pain best. And pain, in this logic, becomes your shield, your language, your home. Therapists who work with this pattern often describe it as a form of emotional scripting, the idea that your nervous system has memorized certain emotional outcomes and now replays them, not because they're optimal, but because they're known, and changing that script isn't about positive thinking or affirmations. It's about gently, persistently introducing new emotional experiences that don't trigger the same old loop, while helping the person feel safe in emotions that were once unavailable. For example, if someone has always felt unworthy of calm, the first step isn't to force peace onto them, but to let them experience tiny moments of stillness without pressure. If someone has always equated love with abandonment, the goal isn't to convince them otherwise overnight, but to allow them to sit in connection without fearing its disappearance. In this way, healing becomes about tolerating goodness, not chasing it. It also helps to name the pattern, to say out loud, "I notice that I reach for pain when I feel uncertain," or "I feel more like myself when I'm hurting," not because you're glorifying it, but because you're witnessing it, and in witnessing, you loosen its hold. You begin to see that pain doesn't have to be the only honest emotion, that maybe joy isn't fake, it's just unfamiliar, and that with time, familiarity can shift. Importantly, this pattern is not a flaw, it's an adaptation, a form of emotional survival that developed in a specific context. And it deserves compassion, not ridicule, because it reflects the brilliance of your mind trying to protect itself, trying to stay connected to something real, even if that something is pain, and the fact that you've made it this far with that system is a testament to your strength, not your brokenness. So the next time you find yourself returning to hurt, ask not what's wrong with me, but what part of me still thinks this is the only way to feel alive, and then ask gently, what else could be true, and sit with the discomfort of that question, not trying to fix it, just holding it, letting it breathe, until maybe, slowly, another kind of feeling becomes possible. You're the one everyone turns to, you're the one who fixes things, calms people down, gives advice, sacrifices your own time to make sure others are okay. And somewhere along the way, maybe without realizing it, you've started to believe that it's your job to carry the weight of other people's emotions, that their happiness depends on your choices, that if you just say the right words or try hard enough or love deeply enough, you can save them from pain, from failure, from themselves. You don't call it saving, not openly, not dramatically, but the idea is there, quietly embedded in your every gesture, every late-night message, every moment where you tell yourself, If I don't help, no one will, and it feels noble. It feels like strength, like compassion, but beneath that surface, something else is happening, a belief, not just that you can help, but that you must, and that your value comes from being the one who always steps in. This is the psychological pattern known as Messiah Syndrome, a deep and often unconscious compulsion to rescue others, rooted not only in empathy, but in identity, in the belief that your role in the world is to fix, to carry, to heal. And while that might sound admirable, it's also exhausting, destabilizing, and sometimes deeply damaging, not just to you, but to the people you think you're helping. Imagine a friend who keeps making the same mistakes again and again, and every time they crash, you're there listening, advising, giving, forgiving, rearranging your own life to accommodate theirs. And maybe for a moment they feel better, maybe they even thank you. Maybe you feel that glow of purpose, but deep down, the cycle doesn't stop, and it never really gets better. And every time you give more of yourself, the problem grows stronger, not weaker. This happens because when you take responsibility for someone else's growth, you accidentally remove their opportunity to take responsibility themselves. And the more you rescue, the more they depend, and the more they depend, the more you feel needed. And suddenly, without intending to, you've built a system where your worth is tied to their weakness, and their pain becomes the fuel for your identity. The roots of Messiah Syndrome often lie in early emotional environments. Perhaps you were the peacemaker in a chaotic household, the helper in a family that didn't know how to help itself, or maybe you were praised only when you were useful, when you suppressed your own needs to make room for others. And slowly, quietly, you learned that love means giving everything, that being good means fixing what's broken, even if it breaks you in the process. Over time, this pattern becomes so ingrained that you don't recognize it as a burden. It feels like who you are, like your purpose. And you may even reject people who don't need saving, because their stability makes you feel useless, invisible, and instead you're drawn to those who are wounded, chaotic, unstable, because their pain activates your script, gives you something to do, someone to become, and without that role, you don't know what to be. But here's the paradox: the more you try to save someone, the less they grow, and the more you sacrifice, the more you disappear, and slowly your relationships become defined not by mutual respect, but by imbalance, by one person giving and the other receiving, until resentment builds beneath the surface. And you start to wonder why you feel so alone, so unseen, even though you're surrounded by people who rely on you. The psychological mechanism at work here is partly about control. By helping others, you feel safe, important, even powerful, but it's also about avoidance. Because as long as you're focused on fixing someone else, you don't have to face your own fears, your own needs, your own unresolved grief, and so the cycle continues. Find someone broken, pour yourself into them, feel important, feel drained, feel betrayed, then repeat, always with the secret hope that this time it will be different. This doesn't mean you're a bad person or that helping is wrong. It means that helping without boundaries becomes a trap, and that believing you're the only one who can save someone is a form of emotional ego, one that hides behind kindness, but often leads to control, exhaustion, and emotional codependency. And worse, it can delay real healing, both for you and for them. Breaking out of Messiah Syndrome isn't easy, because it often feels like abandoning people, like being selfish, like failing the very people you care about. But in reality, stepping back is sometimes the most loving thing you can do, because real support isn't about doing things for others. It's about empowering them to do things for themselves, even if it means they struggle, even if it means they fall. It starts with small things: saying no when you're tired, letting someone feel their own consequences, resisting the urge to send that extra message. To offer that extra explanation, and in those moments, you begin to reclaim your own space, your own energy, your own right to exist without always being in service to someone else's chaos. You also begin to ask different questions: not how can I fix this, but what's mine to carry; not how do I stop their pain, but why do I need their pain to feel needed. And when you answer those questions honestly, you uncover the deeper layers: the fears of being unlovable unless you're useful, the shame of resting, the fear of abandonment if you stop giving, and these truths, once seen, begin to lose their grip. Eventually, you learn a new form of strength, one that doesn't come from rescuing, but from respecting, one that doesn't require martyrdom, but maturity. And you begin to realize that your worth is not measured by how much you suffer for others, but by how clearly you know where you end and where they begin. You can still be kind, still be generous, still care deeply, but now from a place of balance, not obligation, now with the awareness that true connection is built on freedom, not dependence, and that sometimes the best way to help someone is to trust them enough to stand on their own, even if they stumble, even if they walk away. In the end, Messiah Syndrome is not about bad intentions. It's about overgrown empathy, about love without limits, and the path out isn't coldness. It's clarity, it's learning that you don't need to suffer to be worthy, you don't need to fix to be loved, and that your own peace is just as sacred as anyone else's pain. You meet someone who seems lost, maybe they're going through something, maybe they're always going through something, and something in you responds before you even think. Maybe you offer help, maybe just a shoulder to lean on. Maybe it starts with empathy, but somewhere along the way it turns into something else, a dynamic where they need you and you feel responsible. A silent contract forms between you, one that says, "I'll keep saving you if you keep needing me." At first it feels good, it feels meaningful. You feel useful, important, even loved in a certain way, not because they admire you for who you are, but because they rely on you for what you do. And over time, you begin to build your identity around that, being the strong one, the wise one, the patient one, the person who always shows up, no matter how many times they fall apart. This is the beginning of what psychologists call the savior, victim dependency loop, a toxic emotional cycle where one person unconsciously takes on the role of rescuer and the other the role of someone who always needs rescuing. And it's not always dramatic or obvious. Sometimes it hides in soft-spoken apologies, or the phrase, "I don't know what I'd do without you," or the feeling that if you stopped showing up, everything would collapse. You may even feel trapped by your own compassion. You don't want to abandon someone, especially when they're hurting, but you start to notice patterns, that the crisis never ends, that your support never seems to help long-term, that the more you give, the more they depend and the less they seem to grow. And every time you try to pull away, you feel guilty, or they make you feel guilty, or something inside you believes you're cruel for even considering it. In reality, you're not cruel, you're just caught in a loop that feeds on mutual emotional needs, your need to feel needed and their need to be taken care of. And while both of those things are human, they can become distorted when they begin to define the entire relationship. And especially when growth is replaced by repetition, healing by dependency, and love by obligation. Imagine a friend who always finds themselves in trouble. Maybe it's a toxic relationship, maybe it's financial chaos, maybe it's just the ongoing sense that life is too much. And every time you show up, you offer time, money, energy, solutions, and they seem grateful. They may even cry, they may promise change, but nothing changes, and deep down, you start to feel frustrated, even resentful, but you bury it, because good people don't get angry at those who suffer, right? But resentment is a signal. It tells you that you've been overgiving, that your boundaries have been crossed, that you've been participating in a system that looks like support but actually blocks growth. And in the savior-victim loop, that resentment builds on both sides because the savior eventually feels used and the victim eventually feels patronized, and neither person really feels safe or seen or equal. The psychological mechanism here is subtle but powerful. For the savior, helping becomes a way to control uncertainty, to feel secure, to avoid facing their own mess by focusing on someone else's. And for the victim, being helped becomes a way to avoid responsibility, to receive care without the pressure of change, to remain in a familiar position where someone else takes charge. And both roles are comforting in their own way, but both are also stifling, preventing emotional maturity and autonomy. You might recognize this dynamic in your own life, maybe with a partner, a sibling, a friend, where you always feel like the parent, the therapist, the planner, the one holding the emotional map while they wander in circles, and every time you suggest they take the wheel, they panic or guilt you or make you feel like abandoning them, and so you stay, and so the loop continues. One of the hardest things about breaking this cycle is that it feels like betrayal. To stop rescuing someone feels like letting them drown, but in truth, real love does not mean endless saving. It means support with limits, empathy with boundaries, care without codependence. And that means allowing others to feel pain, to make mistakes, to fall and rise on their own, even when you could make it easier. Because the truth is, every time you save someone from the consequences of their own choices, you're not only exhausting yourself, you're robbing them of the chance to learn, to grow, to find strength, and over time, they may even resent you for it, because deep down, no one wants to feel weak forever. And dependency, even when dressed in affection, breeds shame. The path out of this loop begins with awareness, noticing the roles you've both been playing, not with blame, but with honesty, asking, what do I get from being the savior, and what would it mean if I stopped? And those answers may be uncomfortable, maybe you fear being irritable, event or unloved or abandoned, and maybe they fear having to face life alone, to take ownership, to fail without a net. But those fears are not permanent, and they're not fatal, they're just signals that the relationship needs to evolve, from one of emotional fusion to one of mutual respect, from one where help is a lifeline to one where help is a ladder, something that supports without carrying, something that empowers instead of enabling. This might mean saying things you've never said before, I can't keep fixing this for you, or "I believe you can handle this on your own," or even "I need space to take care of myself." And at first, those words might land hard, they might be met with anger, confusion, tears, but over time, they become the ground on which a new kind of connection can grow, one that doesn't depend on constant imbalance. You may also need to grieve not the person but the role, the identity of being the savior, because it's given you meaning, comfort, even a sense of control, and letting it go can feel like losing part of yourself. But what you gain in return is freedom, the freedom to be a whole person, not just a helper, and to relate to others as equals, not projects. And for the other person, the so-called victim, this shift can be terrifying because it means facing their own capacity, their own power, their own responsibility. But it also means reclaiming dignity, agency, and the right to make their own path, even if it's rocky, even if it's slow, because true growth never comes from being carried, it comes from walking. In the end, the savior-victim dependency loop isn't about bad people. It's about unmet needs, unconscious fears, and the ways we try to survive without realizing we're repeating patterns that don't serve us anymore. And the only way out is through honesty, boundaries, and the courage to let go of the need to be needed, and the willingness to believe that others can find their own strength, even when you're not holding them up. You meet someone and they seem perfect, they understand you, they see you, you feel safe with them in a way you haven't felt in years, maybe ever, and your mind begins to paint a picture, not with logic, but with feeling this person is good, kind, real, special, and you don't just like them, you need them, because when they're around, everything feels more stable, more whole, more alive, and when they're gone, even for a day, something feels missing, like part of your identity was built around their presence. This is not obsession, not quite, but a form of idealization, where someone becomes the solution to all the quiet chaos inside you, and you begin to see them not just as a person, but as the answer, the one who finally makes you feel okay, the one who finally gives shape to all the parts of you that once felt shapeless. And when they're good, they're not just good, they're perfect, they're everything, and you want to keep them close, hold them tightly, make sure they never pull away. But then something small happens, maybe they cancel plans, maybe they don't reply as quickly as usual, maybe they say something that makes you feel misunderstood. And suddenly everything flips, the warmth you once felt begins to twist, and now they're cold, selfish, fake, or distant, and your mind rewrites the story not slowly, but instantly. Now they're the problem, the cause of your pain, and you don't just feel hurt, you feel betrayed. This is the core of what psychology calls splitting, a defense mechanism commonly associated with borderline personality traits, but also present in many people under emotional stress. And it works by separating the world into extremes, good or bad, safe or unsafe, right or wrong, because the idea that someone could be both loving and flawed, both present and inconsistent, both kind and imperfect, feels intolerable when your emotional system is already flooded. You don't mean to do it, you don't wake up planning to idolize or to reject, it just happens, because when your emotional wiring is sensitive, inconsistency feels like danger, ambiguity feels like threat, and the way your brain tries to protect you is by simplifying the world, by turning complex people into simple categories, by erasing the gray and replacing it with black and white. It's a survival tool, often formed in childhood environments where love was conditional, where caretakers were unpredictable, where emotional safety depended on reading the room perfectly, on sensing shifts, on adapting quickly, and in that world nuance was dangerous because it meant you didn't know what was coming, so your brain learned to label fast, to react decisively. This person is good, that one is bad, and if someone hurt you once, they must have never truly cared at all. This pattern often continues into adulthood, especially in intimate relationships where emotional stakes are highest, and you might find yourself swinging between extreme closeness and sudden withdrawal. One moment feeling completely fused with someone, the next pushing them away, not because you want to lose them, but because the pain of disappointment feels unbearable, and rejecting them feels safer than holding space for the contradiction. Imagine a partner who forgets your birthday or forgets to call, and instead of thinking, they made a mistake, your mind might whisper, they don't love me, they never did. And in that moment, all the good memories feel false, all the kindness feels erased, and the only story that makes sense is that they've been hiding who they really are, that you were wrong to trust, wrong to open up, and now the only thing to do is shut the door before they hurt you again. But here's the painful truth, splitting doesn't protect you, it isolates you because no one is perfect, no one is consistent all the time. And if your love depends on perfection, you will always end up alone, not because people fail you, but because your mind cannot tolerate their complexity, their humanity, their ability to be both good and flawed, both attentive and distracted, both loving and limited. This creates a painful cycle. You long for connection, you find it, you idealize it, you depend on it. And then the moment something goes wrong, you devalue it, you retreat, you protect yourself. And then you feel abandoned, lonely, confused, and the worst part is, You may not even realize what's happening because it all feels so real, so urgent, so justified, and when someone tries to point it out, it can feel like they're gaslighting you, like they're trying to deny your experience. But the truth is, splitting is not about the other person. It's about your nervous system trying to make sense of emotional risk, trying to manage the chaos of connection by forcing it into binaries. And healing from it doesn't mean never feeling hurt. It means learning to hold both sides, to feel hurt and still believe in the relationship, to feel disappoint. And still know that love exists, to feel afraid and still stay present. This takes practice, patience, and most of all, a willingness to feel discomfort, because the hardest thing about healing splitting is learning to sit in the middle, to stay with the gray, to say, this person hurt me today, but they've also loved me, or I'm angry, but that doesn't mean they're evil. And at first, this feels impossible, it feels unsafe, but over time, it becomes the foundation for real intimacy. You begin to notice when you're slipping into extremes, when the voice in your head says, they never cared, or I was stupid to trust them. And instead of believing it, you pause, you breathe, you ask, what else might be true? And slowly, you reclaim your capacity to see the whole picture, not just the parts that confirm your fear. This doesn't mean tolerating abuse or denying red flags. It means developing emotional complexity, the ability to hold multiple truths at once, to trust your feelings without letting them dictate your entire worldview, to see people clearly without making them gods or monsters. And this, more than anything, is the path to emotional stability, to lasting relationships, to the kind of life where love is no longer a threat, but a space where both you and others are allowed to be fully human. You accomplish something that should make you proud, maybe you get a promotion, maybe you finish a degree, maybe someone compliments your work or tells you that you've made a difference. And while you smile and nod and say thank you, something inside you pulls away, quietly whispering that you didn't really earn this, that it was luck, timing, a mistake, that soon they'll all realize you're not as capable as they think you are. At first you ignore it, you try to move on, but that feeling follows you into every room, every meeting, every new challenge, and no matter how well you perform, no matter how much praise you receive, there's a part of you that believes you're pretending, that you're playing a role, that the real you, the flawed, unsure, imperfect you, is hiding just behind the mask, waiting to be discovered. This is not modesty, not humility, it's something deeper and harder to shake, something psychologists call the impostor phenomenon, a persistent belief that your success is undeserved and that you've fooled everyone around you, and it's not limited to any one type of person. It affects high achievers, creatives, professionals, students, even people with decades of experience, and what they all have in common is a quiet fear that they don't belong in the rooms they've earned their way into. You might recognize this voice when you downplay your accomplishments, saying it was nothing, or I just got lucky, or they probably had no one else, or when you avoid applying for things you're qualified for, or stay silent in meetings even when you have something to say, or when you finish something good and feel more relief that you didn't mess it up than pride that you created it. The irony is, the more you achieve, the worse it can get, because now there's more to lose, more people to disappoint, more pressure to maintain the illusion of competence. And instead of celebrating your growth, you fear exposure, and every new challenge feels like a test you're destined to fail, even if you've passed it many times before. Psychologically, the imposter phenomenon is rooted in a gap between internal and external perception. Other people see your output, your results, your successes, but you see the process, the doubts, the mistakes, the moments of confusion, and because you know how imperfect the process was, it's hard to believe the outcome was truly deserved. You compare your insides to everyone else's outsides, their confidence, their polished words, their clear decisions, not realizing that they may be doing the same thing with you, because very few people show their self-doubt publicly, and even fewer admit that they sometimes feel like frauds themselves. Imagine a surgeon with 20 years of experience who still lies awake at night wondering if they're qualified, or a best-selling author who feels sick every time they release a new book because this might be the one that exposes them, or a teacher who's been praised by generations of students but still feels like they're winging it every day. And what these people have in common isn't incompetence. It's a deeply human sensitivity to being seen, to being judged, to the possibility that they're not enough. The imposter phenomenon often begins in childhood. Maybe you grew up with very high expectations, where success was assumed and failure wasn't discussed, or maybe you were praised only when you achieved, not for who you were, or maybe you were constantly compared to others, so you learned to measure your worth externally, never feeling quite like you measured up. Or maybe you were part of a group that wasn't expected to succeed, the first in your family to go to college, the only woman in a male-dominated field, the only person of color in the room. And so you internalize the idea that you're an exception, that you got there by accident, that you don't truly fit, even if the evidence says otherwise. And once the pattern is established, it feeds itself. Every success brings anxiety, every compliment feels suspicious, and every mistake feels like proof of your secret unworthiness. And so you work harder, stay later, overprepare, hoping to cover up the imagined gap between who you are and who people think you are. But no amount of effort can erase a belief that was never built on facts. And over time, this can lead to burnout, anxiety, and emotional exhaustion, not because you're failing, but because you're constantly trying to prove that you're not failing, and that pressure builds silently, invisibly, until it begins to affect your health, your relationships, and your sense of identity. The way out of the imposter phenomenon isn't to wait until you feel ready or confident, because confidence often comes after action, not before, and it's not about convincing yourself that you're the best, but rather accepting that being human means being imperfect, that success doesn't require flawlessness, and that making mistakes doesn't disqualify you from belonging. It also means learning to trust feedback, not as flattery, but as reality. When people thank you, compliment you, promote you, you don't have to argue with them in your head. You can say thank you and let it be true, even if it feels strange at first, even if your inner critic tries to rewrite it. And maybe most of all, it means understanding that you are not alone, that the people you admire, the people you think have it all figured out, are often carrying the same fear, and that what separates those who keep growing isn't the absence of doubt, but the decision to keep going anyway, to keep showing up, to keep trusting that you are allowed to be in the room, not because you tricked anyone, but because you've earned it, even if your mind hasn't caught up to that truth yet. You want something simple, maybe it's a person's attention, maybe it's closure from a past event, maybe it's just an answer to a question that keeps circling in your head, and when you don't get it, when the result stays just out of reach, something strange begins to happen, because your desire doesn't fade, it grows, it multiplies, it sharpens, until suddenly that one thing, that one unanswered moment, starts to take up space in your mind far beyond its size in reality. And even though you know it's not rational, even though you understand that the world won't end if you let it go, something deep inside you won't. You replay the last conversation in your head again and again. You check the message thread looking for a signal you missed. You try to calculate whether your response was too much or not enough. And somewhere in the middle of all that rumination, the original desire transforms. It's no longer about wanting something because it's meaningful. It becomes about wanting it because you didn't get it. And now, because it was denied, your mind treats it like proof that something is wrong with you. That something must be fixed, that the only way forward is to resolve the loop, even if that loop is entirely inside your own head. This is the psychology of frustration-induced obsession, a pattern where the brain clings harder to things that are uncertain, incomplete, or out of reach. And while it can happen in relationships, like when someone pulls away just enough to keep your attention but never close enough to meet your needs, it also happens with goals, ideas, memories, and even interactions that should be forgettable, but instead become sticky, unresolved, and emotionally charged. The mechanism is simple but powerful. Your brain is wired to seek closure, to resolve ambiguity, and when something interrupts that process, when an expected outcome doesn't happen, your mind doesn't move on, it loops, it spins, it obsesses, because it doesn't just want the thing anymore, it wants relief from the tension of not having it, and that relief becomes the goal, even if chasing it leads nowhere. Think about a time when you sent a message and got no reply, and instead of shrugging and continuing with your day, you felt anxious, confused, maybe even a little rejected, and the longer the silence lasted, the louder the story in your head became. Maybe they're ignoring you on purpose. Maybe you said something wrong, maybe you're not worth responding to, and now, instead of focusing on your own peace, you're investing more and more energy into decoding someone else's silence. Or imagine applying for a job you really wanted, going through multiple interviews, feeling hopeful, only to be met with nothing, no rejection, no explanation, just silence, and suddenly your mind replays every step, wondering if you smiled too much or too little, if your answer was too honest or not confident enough. And instead of closing the chapter, your brain keeps flipping back to it, trying to solve a puzzle that no longer exists outside of your own emotional need for resolution. This kind of obsession is not the same as clinical OCD or delusional fixation. It's more subtle, more common, and in many ways more socially acceptable because people often don't see it as a problem. They just say they're overthinking or hung up or trying to understand. But what they're really doing is feeding a loop that feeds itself. The more they think about it, the more urgent it feels, and the more urgent it feels, the harder it becomes to stop thinking about it. At its core, this pattern is driven by a mismatch between expectation and reality. You expected a certain reaction, response, or reward, And when that didn't happen, your brain registered it as an error, as something incomplete. And like a computer program stuck in a bug, it keeps trying to execute the same function, hoping that this time it will work, this time it will resolve, this time the missing piece will click into place. But reality doesn't work like code. People don't always explain why they disappear, emotions don't always align with logic, and some stories never get the ending you wanted, not because you failed, but because the other side was never in your control to begin with. And until your mind accepts that some loops have no closure, you'll keep pulling at threads that don't unravel, hoping that clarity will come from repetition, when often it only comes from release. The real danger of frustration-induced obsession isn't just wasted time or emotional fatigue, it's distortion, because the longer you stay inside the loop, the more exaggerated the importance of the thing becomes. And something that started small, a moment of confusion, a tiny rejection, a miscommunication, becomes inflated, symbolic, emotionally loaded, and now it's no longer just about that one person or event. It's about your worth, your desirability, your success or failure as a person. That's why letting go isn't always as simple as people make it sound. It's not just about distraction or moving on. It's about facing the discomfort of not knowing, of not fixing, of not completing a story that you desperately want to end a certain way. And that kind of discomfort can feel intolerable if you've never been taught how to sit with it. Many people who struggle with this pattern were raised in environments where certainty was equated with safety, where unanswered questions were punished, where mistakes had consequences, where emotional closure was rare or manipulated, and so as adults, they seek resolution not just as a preference, but as a psychological need, a survival instinct, and anything that remains vague or unresolved feels like a threat to their stability. Others may have perfectionist tendencies, the belief that every interaction must be clean, every goal must be met, every feeling must be explained. And when life inevitably resists that control, the response is obsession, not because they want to suffer, but because their mind has never learned how to coexist with mess, with mystery, with the uncontrollable. Healing from this pattern doesn't mean you stop caring or that you never think deeply about things. It means learning to recognize when your thoughts are no longer serving you, when your attention has become a trap, and when your need for closure is costing you peace. And in that moment, the skill isn't solving, it's releasing. You don't need to know why they didn't respond. You don't need to figure out what you did wrong. You don't need to decode every silence or reverse engineer every rejection. Sometimes the healthiest thing you can do is say, I may never understand this, and that's okay. Because when you make peace with the gap between expectation and reality, you reclaim your energy, your focus, and your ability to live in the present, not inside the mental echo of a moment that has already passed. This doesn't happen overnight. Your brain will still try to circle back, to find the missing piece, to close the loop. But every time you choose to return your attention to now, every time you stop feeding the fire of obsession with the fuel of what if, you build a new muscle, the ability to let go without needing to be right, the strength to move forward without every answer, the freedom to feel whole even when some parts of the story remain open-ended. And over time, that's what breaks the loop, not resolution, but refusal to keep chasing it, not a final answer, but a quiet decision to stop asking questions that no longer serve your growth. You know someone who always seems young, not just in appearance or energy, but in their way of seeing the world. They avoid responsibility, they shy away from long-term commitments, they chase excitement but run from stability. And while at first it feels fun, even refreshing, over time something feels off, because behind the charm and spontaneity is a deep resistance to growing up, a quiet refusal to face the emotional weight of adulthood, and when problems arise, their answer is always the same. Escape, denial, deflection, or delay. This is what psychologists refer to as the Peter Pan complex, a pattern where a person, usually an adult, resists the psychological responsibilities of maturity, often clinging to the behaviors, mindset, or emotional habits of youth, not out of joy or creativity, but out of fear, avoidance, or trauma that never resolved. And though it's not a formal disorder in clinical manuals, it's a real, recognized psychological profile that shows up again and again, especially in relationships, families, and personal development paths. You might notice it in someone who refuses to settle down, who avoids making long-term plans, who changes jobs constantly to avoid accountability, or who jokes their way out of serious conversations, or in someone who struggles with empathy, doesn't understand how their actions affect others, and seems perpetually surprised when consequences finally arrive, as if life should remain a playground forever. It's not the love of fun that's the issue. It's the pattern of avoiding the discomforts of adulthood, things like managing finances, accepting emotional pain, building resilience, tolerating boredom, supporting others, or facing the consequences of past actions. And when those moments arrive, the person with a Peter Pan complex often disappears emotionally or physically or both, because to them, maturity feels like a trap, and freedom means not being tied to anything that requires effort, depth, or permanence. Imagine being in a relationship with someone like this. At first, they make you laugh, they're spontaneous, they don't take life too seriously, and it feels like a breath of fresh air compared to the rigid, overly serious people you've known. But after a while, you notice that every time you talk about the future, they change the subject. Every time you express a need, they make a joke. Every time a challenge arises, they seem more interested in avoiding it than working through it with you. You feel like you're carrying the weight of the relationship while they get to stay light, and when you ask for more emotional presence or practical help, they either get defensive or disappear. And you start to wonder if they're unwilling or maybe unable to meet you at the level of adulthood that relationships require. This complex doesn't mean someone is selfish or malicious. It usually means they've associated maturity with pain, shame, or fear. Maybe they grew up too fast, raised younger siblings, experienced trauma early, or were punished for making mistakes, and now, as adults, they've swung in the opposite direction, refusing to re-enter that emotional territory, building a life where nothing sticks long enough to hurt, and no one gets close enough to require real vulnerability. In some cases, this behavior is reinforced by the world around them. Maybe they're charming enough that people make excuses for them. Maybe they're attractive enough that partners forgive their immaturity. Maybe their friends are all stuck in the same loop, enabling each other to stay emotionally 15 even as the years go by. And as long as there's no hard consequence, the illusion works, the fantasy holds, the game continues. But underneath the surface, there's often a quiet anxiety, a fear of aging, a fear of being seen, a fear of being left behind, and no matter how much fun they seem to have, there's a lingering dissatisfaction, a sense of aimlessness, a restlessness that doesn't go away, because play without purpose becomes empty over time, and escaping responsibility eventually becomes its own kind of prison. Psychologically, the Peter Pan complex can develop when someone's emotional development is interrupted. They might have been neglected, overprotected, or praised only for being cute, clever, or entertaining, and so their sense of self became tied to being liked rather than being whole, and maturity, which requires imperfection, effort, and truth, became something to fear rather than embrace. These individuals may also struggle with identity formation, not knowing who they really are outside of how they're perceived, and that lack of internal grounding makes it easier to float from job to job, partner to partner, hobby to hobby, without ever settling into a deeper sense of self or meaning. And while society often glamorizes youth and celebrates the carefree lifestyle, the cost of this complex becomes clear over time: broken relationship. P.S. Stunted careers, emotional isolation, and a nagging sense that something important is being avoided. Because growth is not the enemy of joy, it's the path to deeper, more lasting forms of it. Healing from the Peter Pan complex doesn't mean giving up fun or becoming a rigid adult with no room for spontaneity. It means learning to carry responsibility without losing lightness, facing pain without losing hope, accepting limits without losing dreams, and most of all, it means becoming someone who doesn't need to run away from life in order to feel free. This starts with facing the emotional roots, asking why responsibility feels threatening, why stability feels suffocating, why intimacy triggers avoidance, and then slowly building the emotional muscles that were never fully developed, things like patience, presence, empathy, and consistency, not perfectly, not all at once, but piece by piece, step by step. It also means learning to see adulthood not as the end of fun, but as the beginning of a deeper, more grounded freedom, where your choices create real impact, your actions shape real futures, and your relationships can finally rest on something stronger than performance or escape. The Peter Pan complex isn't about loving youth, it's about fearing what comes after, and the real growth happens when you realize that growing up isn't about losing yourself. It's about finding the parts of you that were waiting for a stable enough ground to finally emerge. Because being forever young might sound poetic in a song, but in real life, the magic comes when you learn how to build something that lasts, not just for others, but for yourself. And that kind of magic doesn't fade with age, it grows, deepens, and becomes more real with every brave step you take toward wholeness. You find yourself reacting strongly to someone, maybe it's the way they talk, the choices they make, or how they carry themselves. And even though they've never harmed you directly, something about them stirs something deep inside you, something uncomfortable, something disproportionate to the situation, and you're not sure why, but you feel anger, disgust, judgment, or even fear. and you convince yourself that it's about them, that it's because they're arrogant or lazy or fake or cruel, but in truth, something deeper may be happening beneath your awareness. This is what Carl Jung called shadow projection, a psychological process in which parts of yourself that you reject, disown, or fear are unconsciously seen in others, creating emotional intensity not because of who they are, but because of what they reflect back to you. And unlike ordinary disagreement or dislike, projection carries weight, it feels charged, it follows you, and it attaches to people in patterns, often reappearing across relationships, workplaces, and even in strangers. The shadow in Jungian psychology refers to the parts of your psyche that you push into the background, traits you were taught to avoid, emotions you were told not to express, impulses that didn't fit your self-image. And instead of dealing with them directly, your mind hides them away, not destroying them, but relocating them, out of sight but not out of influence, waiting for a mirror in someone else to bring them back to your attention. For example, you might see someone being assertive and immediately label them aggressive, because somewhere along the way, you learned that being assertive was dangerous or unacceptable. And so you disown that part of yourself, or maybe someone expresses emotion openly and you roll your eyes or feel contempt because you were taught to suppress your failings, and now you see vulnerability as weakness, not because it is, but because you had to bury it. Or you might be drawn to someone's confidence, but also resentful of it, because deep down, you want to express yourself that freely but fear what would happen if you did. And so your mind paints their confidence as arrogance, not because they've wronged you, but because they awaken the part of you that wants to come alive but was never allowed to. This is the paradox of shadow projection. The qualities you most dislike in others are often the ones you've exiled in yourself, and the more you suppress them, the more others seem to provoke you, not by accident, but as if your psyche is trying to get your attention, trying to show you what's been hidden, not to punish you, but to bring you back into wholeness. You might notice that your judgments are often black and white. He's a narcissist. She's fake. They're useless. And while sometimes those labels are accurate, many times they're shortcuts, emotional reactions to something that feels dangerous, not in them, but in you, something unresolved, something forbidden, something unacknowledged. Projection doesn't make you a bad person, it makes you human. It's a defense mechanism that helps you avoid painful self-reflection, but it also keeps you stuck, because as long as the problem is always out there, you never look inward, and the shadow stays in the dark, growing stronger, more influential, more reactive, until it shapes your choices, relationships, and even your identity. The shadow isn't only made of negative traits. Sometimes you project your gifts too, creativity, strength, confidence, onto others you admire, believing they're special while you are ordinary, not realizing that the qualities you recognize in them are possible for you too, but have been locked away by fear, shame, or neglect. Imagine someone who criticizes others for being attention-seeking but secretly longs to be seen, or someone who mocks romantic gestures but deeply craves love, or someone who calls others weak but hides their own vulnerability behind sarcasm or control. In each case, the shadow is speaking, not through words, but through projection, creating stories to protect the ego, but also revealing where healing needs to happen. Healing the shadow begins with awareness, noticing when your emotional reactions are bigger than the situation warrants, when you feel irrationally angry, disgusted, or obsessed, and instead of doubling down on judgment, asking quietly, what part of me does this person remind me of? Or what would it mean if I allowed that trait to exist in myself, even just a little? It also means learning to tolerate discomfort, the discomfort of not having all the answers, the discomfort of seeing your own contradictions, the discomfort of realizing that the enemy outside might be a reflection of the conflict inside. And it means replacing shame with curiosity, blame with self-inquiry, and defense with openness. You don't have to accept harmful behavior from others. Shadow work isn't about excusing real harm, but it is about discerning when your reaction is about them and when it's about you, when the trigger is present and when it's historic, when the danger is real and when it's psychological. Over time, as you reclaim the parts of yourself that you once buried, you begin to see others more clearly, not as enemies or projections, but as whole people, and you gain more choice, more clarity, more peace, because you're no longer fighting battles that started inside but are being played out externally. Jung believed that integrating the shadow is essential to personal growth, not by eliminating it, but by recognizing it, making it conscious, allowing it to speak without letting it control you, and in doing so, you become more complete, more grounded, more authentic, not perfect, but whole. You stop needing to be the good guy all the time, or the smart one, or the nice one, and instead you become real, someone who can feel anger without destroying, who can feel fear without hiding, who can feel envy without resenting, someone who sees themselves in others not as a threat, but as a mirror. Because the shadow is not your enemy, it's the part of you waiting to be understood, the part that holds the key to your fullness. And when you stop running from it, you begin to find the courage to be who you really are, not just who you've been trained to appear. You donate to charity in the morning, maybe just a few dollars online, or you help someone carry their groceries, or you let someone merge into traffic without honking. And for a moment you feel good, you feel like a decent person, like someone who makes the world slightly better. And then later that same day, you skip the gym, you eat fast food, or maybe you gossip a little or cut corners at work, and it doesn't feel as bad as it usually would. Almost as if some internal scale is balancing things out, as if you've earned a pass for doing something right. This is a mental habit known as moral compensation bias, a psychological phenomenon where people subconsciously allow themselves to make morally questionable choices after having done something good, as if good behavior gives them credit they can spend on less virtuous actions, and though it seems harmless at first glance, it can subtly undermine personal growth, accountability, and even long-term ethical behavior. You've seen this play out in different ways. Someone sticks to a healthy diet for a few days and then rewards themselves with binge eating, or someone who prides themselves on being honest makes a small lie and justifies it because, in their mind, they're still a good person overall. Or someone donates money to a cause but treats people in their daily life with coldness or impatience, believing the good deed offsets the bad mood. It's not always conscious. Most of the time, people don't sit down and think, I did something good, now I'll do something bad. Instead, it shows up in subtle internal shifts, in lowered resistance to temptation, in quiet self-justification, in the relaxed grip of self-control, and it gives the illusion of balance while allowing unhealthy or unethical patterns to slip through. At its core, this bias stems from how the brain organizes moral identity, not as a stable whole, but as a fluctuating system of gains and losses, like a points-based economy. And when you accumulate enough moral points, your internal alarm system relaxes, making you more vulnerable to slipping into behaviors you'd usually avoid. It's similar to how some people justify cutting in line or being rude after a stressful day. I've been through a lot, I deserve this. Or how others justify ignoring responsibilities after doing something productive. I finished my work early, so now I can waste a few hours online. In each case, the mind seeks balance, but not in a helpful or fair way. It seeks emotional relief, even if it leads to self-sabotage. Moral compensation becomes especially problematic when it masks deeper issues, like using charity to avoid personal accountability, or using kindness as a shield for unresolved resentment, or using good deeds as a way to feel superior while avoiding growth in areas that are more challenging. And over time, it can lead to a distorted self-image, where someone believes they're moral or ethical, not because of consistency, but because of isolated acts of goodness that are used to excuse recurring patterns of avoidance or harm. This isn't just about individuals. Entire institutions and systems operate under this bias. A company might promote a social cause publicly while mistreating workers privately. A person might support justice online while manipulating others in their personal life. A politician might donate to schools while cutting healthcare. And the contradiction is hidden behind the emotional relief that good actions bring, a relief that can blind people to the harm they're simultaneously causing. In your own life, this bias might show up when you give yourself permission to slack off, lie, avoid, or retreat from discomfort, not because you're malicious or irresponsible, but because you believe you've earned the right to be imperfect. And while that sounds human and even healthy in some cases, the real danger comes when this habit becomes automatic, when good actions are no longer about doing what's right, but about buying emotional credit to spend on unconscious impulses. Over time, this creates a loop. You do good to feel good, then do bad and justify it with the good, then feel guilty and do more good, not from the heart, but from compensation. And while it might look like moral effort on the surface, underneath, it's a treadmill, a constant trading of behavior for self-worth, rather than a grounded, integrated sense of self. To break free from moral compensation bias, the first step is noticing the pattern, paying attention to when your behavior starts to shift after doing something right, when your inner voice says, you've earned this, in situations that don't align with your actual values, when your self-image becomes a bargaining chip rather than a compass. Then comes a deeper shift, seeing morality not as a ledger to balance, but as a practice to embody, understanding that being a good person isn't about making up for mistakes with points, but about learning. growing and acting in ways that align with your principles, even when it's inconvenient or unrewarded. This doesn't mean being perfect, it means being honest with yourself, recognizing when your good actions are coming from integrity and when they're coming from guilt or pressure, and refusing to let one part of you excuse another, because all parts of you matter, and true balance comes from coherence, not from emotional transactions. It also means developing self-compassion that doesn't require compensation, being kind to yourself when you fall short, not by justifying the behavior, but by acknowledging it, understanding it, and choosing to realign, not because you need to earn your way back to goodness, but because you already care about who you are becoming. When you live without this bias, your actions stop being bargaining chips and start becoming reflections. Reflections of the kind of person you want to be, not occasionally, but consistently, not for credit, but for clarity, not for others, but for the peace of knowing that your values are not just ideas you admire, but choices you live. There are moments when you catch yourself doing something that doesn't quite make sense, not to others and sometimes not even to you. Maybe you procrastinate on things that matter deeply to you, or you self-sabotage just as something good is starting to happen, or you pick fights in relationships that are finally feeling safe, or you find yourself returning to old patterns that you know will hurt. And when you look at it logically, none of it adds up because there's no clear benefit, no reward. No obvious explanation, yet the behavior continues anyway, quiet but persistent, like an invisible current pulling you backwards. Freud had a theory about this, something he called the death drive or Thanatos, a counterforce to Eros, the life instinct. And while the life drive pushes you to survive, to grow, to bond, to build, the death drive is something darker, more silent, more hidden, pulling you toward stillness, toward regression, even toward destruction, not because you want to die, but because there is something in the psyche that resists too much tension, too much effort, too much exposure, and sometimes even too much happiness. It sounds strange at first, the idea that part of you might crave collapse, but when you look more closely, you start to see the outlines of it in the quiet ways you avoid progress, in the small decisions that chip away at your goals, in the part of you that doesn't trust joy, that feels undeserving of peace, or that flinches when things start going well because deep down, you're waiting for it all to fall apart anyway. This drive doesn't scream, it whispers in the fatigue that makes no sense, in the thoughts that say, why bother, in the temptations that appear when you're closest to success, in the pull toward numbness or chaos or withdrawal. And it doesn't mean you're broken or doomed or suicidal. It means your psyche, like all psyche is managing forces that don't always move in the same direction. And sometimes the desire for rest becomes a desire for disappearance. You might notice it in the way you delay things that matter, or in the voice that says you'll never make it, just when you start to believe that maybe you could. You might see it in the addictions that numb, in the relationships you sabotage, in the choices that make your world smaller rather than bigger. And the logic is not straightforward, because the death drive doesn't operate through reason, it operates through relief. The relief of not trying, of not hoping, of not being seen, of giving up the pressure to strive, to impress. To be anything more than invisible. In some people it looks like apathy, in others like perfectionism. Both are ways to escape the burden of living fully, and in many, it shows up as chronic self-defeat, patterns of almost getting there, moments of near arrival followed by collapse, and it's not laziness, it's not weakness, it's the quiet presence of a force that believes rest can only be earned through ruin, or that peace can only come when the fight is over, even if that means losing. Freud believed this drive was fundamental, not pathological, that all living beings have within them a tension between life and death, between movement and stillness, and that understanding this duality is part of understanding yourself. Because the goal is not to eliminate the death drive, but to recognize it, to notice when it's guiding your choices, to bring it into awareness so that it doesn't control you from the shadows. You may remember moments where you pulled away from something you truly wanted, a project, a person, an opportunity, not because you didn't care, but because something in you was afraid of what would happen if you actually succeeded, if you actually stayed, if you actually felt good, and that fear is often rooted in old wounds, in learned shame, in the belief that joy is dangerous or fleeting or simply not for you. So the death drive becomes a kind of defense. If you never try, you can't fail. If you never love, you can't lose. If you never hope, you can't be disappointed. And that logic, while emotionally understandable, slowly erodes your sense of aliveness, your ability to engage, to create, to care. And over time, you stop risking, and then you stop dreaming, and then you stop moving, not in body, but in spirit. But recognizing this pattern gives you power, because once you see it, you can question it, you can ask why rest must mean ruin, why safety must mean silence, why peace can't be found in presence rather than absence. You can begin to rewrite the script that says collapse is comfort, and instead allow yourself to rest without disappearing, to pause without quitting, to feel without drowning. The antidote to the death drive isn't hustle or denial, it's integration, making space for the part of you that feels tired, that feels afraid, that longs to let go, and instead of suppressing it, listening to it, understanding what it's really asking for. Maybe it's not death it wants, but rest, not failure but relief, not silence but gentleness, and when you give yourself those things without destruction, the grip of Thanatos loosens. You begin to move toward life not by force but by trust, trusting that you don't have to earn your right to be here, that you don't have to break in order to feel, that you don't have to collapse in order to reset, and slowly, moment by moment, you start to choose actions that build. Even if they're small, you start to stay in places that scare you. You start to reach for joy, not because it's guaranteed, but because you are willing to try. And in that trying, you become more whole, not because the death drive disappears, but because it no longer defines you. You carry it with awareness, you move with it instead of against it, and you begin to live, not perfectly, but deliberately, knowing that life is made not just of victories, but of the decision to keep going, even when part of you wants to stop. You believe you're reasonable, most of the time at least. You believe your opinions come from logic, from lived experience, from common sense. And more than that, you assume most people probably feel the same way, at least the reasonable ones do. And so when someone strongly disagrees with you about politics or relationships or how to raise a child or whether something is offensive or harmless or whether pineapple belongs on pizza, it doesn't just surprise you, it feels wrong. Like they're missing something obvious, like they're somehow out of sync with reality, and you start to question their judgment or character or intelligence, not because you're arrogant, but because part of you genuinely believed you weren't alone in your thinking. This is the false consensus effect, a cognitive bias where people overestimate the extent to which others share their beliefs, preferences, values, or behaviors. And it's one of the most subtle and widespread distortions in human psychology, because it hides behind the illusion of normalcy, the idea that your perspective is not just your own, but somehow representative of how most decent, informed people would think if they were just paying attention. It happens automatically. Your brain uses your own beliefs as a kind of reference point for what's likely or typical, and since you're always around yourself, your thoughts and behaviors seem familiar, and familiarity becomes mistaken for truth. So when you imagine others, your mind fills in the gaps with versions of yourself, even when reality suggests otherwise. You might notice it when you say something you think is obvious, and the room goes silent, or when you make a joke and no one laughs, or when you assume everyone in a group agrees with your take on a moral issue, only to discover they don't, and that gap between your assumption and reality can feel jarring, even offensive, because your sense of being in sync with the world has been quietly challenged. This effect shows up in politics, where people on both sides often believe their views are the majority, even when they're not, or in workplaces, where someone might assume everyone thinks the same way about a decision or policy, because they've only spoken to others who agree with them, or in families, where values are passed down so seamlessly that it's hard to imagine how others could see things differently, until you step outside your bubble and realize the world is more fragmented than you thought. The false consensus effect also plays a role in relationships, where you might assume your partner or friend agrees with your idea of fairness or respect or intimacy, simply because you do, and it's not until conflict arises that you realize how different your internal rules actually are, and the confusion or frustration that follows is amplified by this bias, because it doesn't feel like a disagreement, it feels like a violation of something that should be shared. Even in everyday choices, like what movies are funny, what clothes are stylish, what behaviors are acceptable in public, people tend to assume that their own preferences are more common than they actually are, which makes it easier to judge others for deviating, and harder to admit when you yourself are in the minority. The psychology behind this effect is tied to self-validation. When you believe others share your beliefs, it reinforces your confidence, it makes your worldview feel stable, and your identity feel coherent. But when others don't agree, especially in large numbers, it forces a kind of cognitive dissonance, because now you have to decide whether you're wrong or they are, or whether truth is messier than you thought. To avoid that discomfort, the mind leans on shortcuts. It surrounds itself with agreement, seeks confirmation, avoids complexity, and that's how echo chambers are built, not just online but in everyday life, in who you talk to, what you read, what you believe others believe, and slowly the illusion of consensus grows, until it feels like the whole world thinks like you do, except for a few strange outliers. The danger is not just in being wrong, it's in becoming rigid, in assuming that disagreement is stupidity or malice, rather than a sign of diversity, of different experiences, of valid complexity. And over time, this rigidity can turn into judgment, into polarization, into an inability to learn, because you're no longer engaging with others as full individuals, but as projections of your own assumptions. You might notice this bias in others more easily than in yourself, in someone who can't believe anyone would vote for that person, or in someone shocked that a certain joke offended people, or in someone who thinks their parenting style is obviously the best, and assumes everyone else must be either following it or failing. And while it's tempting to roll your eyes, the truth is you probably do it too, just in different ways in different topics. Fr. Own your own vantage point. The antidote to the false consensus effect isn't to distrust your own perspective, it's to hold it with humility, to remember that your view is shaped by your culture, your upbringing, your context, and that others, living completely different lives, might have equally strong convictions that feel just as obvious to them. And that doesn't make either of you foolish, it makes you human. You don't have to agree with everyone, but you do have to remember that your view isn't a default, it's a position. And when you treat it as one perspective among many, rather than the standard against which others are measured, you create space for dialogue, for learning, for the surprising richness that comes when two people truly see each other not as reflections, but as different and still worthy of being heard. You can start by noticing when you're shocked by disagreement and asking yourself, did I ever check whether this was common or did I just assume? Or by seeking out voices that challenge your beliefs, not to fight them, but to understand what makes them tick, or by reminding yourself that your way of doing things is one thread in a much bigger tapestry, and that seeing the full picture doesn't weaken your place in it, it strengthens it. Because the truth is, the world is more varied, more contradictory, more astonishing than any one person's mental map could capture. And when you let go of the illusion that everyone secretly agrees with you, you free yourself to explore it with curiosity instead of control. You're sitting across from someone, a friend, a partner, a colleague, and as they begin to talk, you notice your face starts to shift slightly, matching their expressions. Your tone subtly mirrors theirs, your body posture begins to resemble theirs, and before you realize it, you're feeling something that wasn't originally yours, maybe sadness, maybe anxiety, maybe excitement, but it didn't come from within, it came from them, and you absorbed it as if it were your own. This is not empathy in the traditional sense. It's not understanding someone's emotions. It's becoming them for a moment, not by choice but by reflex, a phenomenon that psychologists sometimes describe as emotional mirroring, or what we might call emotional mirroring syndrome, when this tendency becomes extreme, automatic, and overwhelming in everyday interactions. At first glance, it seems like a gift, being able to feel what others feel, and in small doses, it is. It helps with connection, rapport, understanding, it builds social bridges. But when the mirroring becomes chronic and unconscious, it stops being a tool and becomes a trap, especially when you can no longer tell where someone else ends and you begin. You walk into a room and feel tense, not because anything happened to you, but because someone else is nervous, and now your body is acting like you're in danger, even though your own thoughts were calm, or maybe you're spending time with someone who's subtly bitter or angry, and after the conversation you find yourself feeling irritable for no clear reason, or you're around someone who's excited, and suddenly you're more animated than usual. But when you're alone again, the energy drains and you don't know why. You've become a kind of emotional sponge, soaking up the atmosphere, mirroring the emotions of others automatically. And over time, this can make your own emotional life feel like a blur, not because you don't feel, but because your feelings are constantly being shaped by whoever happens to be near you. For some people, this starts early, maybe in childhood, in a family where staying emotionally attuned was a survival strategy, where noticing subtle shifts in tone, in facial expression, in mood was how you stayed safe or useful or invisible, and over time this hypertunement becomes internalized until it's no longer something you do, it's something you are. The lines blur, someone's disappointment feels like your failure, someone's sadness makes you feel heavy, someone's anger activates your shame, and the worst part is you can't explain it, because it doesn't feel borrowed, it feels real, it feels yours. And it leaves you confused, exhausted, or even guilty for things that have nothing to do with you. This kind of emotional mirroring becomes especially difficult in close relationships. When your partner is stressed, you're stressed. When they're moody, you start doubting yourself. When they're calm, you finally exhale, and your nervous system becomes regulated not by your own internal compass, but by theirs, which means your peace is always at the mercy of someone else's storm. You might think you're just sensitive or caring or deeply empathetic, and maybe you are, but if your emotional state is always being dictated by the emotional weather of others, then what you're experiencing isn't just connection, it's enmeshment, It's a lack of boundary between what's yours and what's not, and it's not sustainable. Over time, people with this pattern begin to lose track of their own preferences, their own feelings, even their identity, not because they don't have one, but because it's constantly being rearranged to accommodate others, and they might seem agreeable, pleasant, low maintenance, but inside they feel unstable, not because they're weak, but because their emotional foundation is always shifting. The psychological cost is subtle but profound. You begin to doubt your instincts because so many of your feelings feel foreign. You begin to withdraw from social settings, not because you dislike people, but because every interaction leaves you drained or altered, and you may even start to resent the people you care about, not because they're doing something wrong, but because being around them feels like becoming them, and you miss the feeling of being yourself. In therapeutic terms, this kind of pattern is often linked to poor emotional boundaries, not physical boundaries or time boundaries, but the boundary between your emotional world and someone else's, and without that internal line, your emotional system becomes porous, reactive, easily hijacked by the moods of others, even when you try to stay centered. But the good news is this pattern isn't permanent. Awareness begins to change it. When you notice that your mood suddenly shifted after talking to someone, you can pause and ask, was this mine or did I pick it up? And in that moment, you start to build a muscle that differentiates between self and other, between empathy and entanglement. It's also helpful to notice what kind of people activate this response more strongly. Sometimes it's people who are very expressive, or very emotionally dominant, or very unpredictable, and other times it's the people you feel responsible for, the people you want to help or please or fix, and that urge to manage their emotions becomes the doorway through which their emotions enter you. Over time, setting emotional boundaries doesn't mean caring less. It means caring with more clarity, being able to say, I see you, I feel you, but I am not you, and that line, when practiced, becomes a form of strength, not coldness. It allows you to stay grounded in the presence of someone else's storm, to be supportive without being swallowed, to connect without losing yourself in the process. In practical terms, this might look like taking space after an intense conversation, checking in with your own body to see what feels real and what feels borrowed, learning to sit with discomfort without automatically absorbing it, and remembering that sometimes the most compassionate thing you can do is to stay rooted in your own center, even when someone else is spinning. The world needs people who can feel deeply, who can attune and support and understand, but those same people need to protect their energy, because constant emotional merging is not empathy, it's erosion, and your ability to care for others depends on your ability to know and care for yourself first. You watch someone you admire, maybe it's a public figure, an artist, a leader, a character from a movie, and something about them speaks to something in you. It feels personal, almost like recognition, like you found a version of yourself you hadn't seen before. And instead of just appreciating them, you begin to model yourself after them, not consciously at first, but subtly in how you speak, how you walk, how you think, and slowly, without noticing, you stop asking who you are and start becoming who they are. This is what happens in over-identification with role models, a psychological pattern where admiration turns into imitation and imitation into identity. And though it begins innocently, even inspiringly, it can quietly lead to confusion, dependence, and emotional fragility, especially when your sense of self becomes entangled with someone else's story. At first, it might look like motivation. You find someone who has achieved something you dream of, or who embodies qualities you respect, and you start taking notes, literally or emotionally. You follow their habits, read what they read, think the way they think, dress the way they dress, and this can feel empowering because they offer a clear template, a path, a vision of who you could be if you tried hard enough. But over time, this identification becomes less about growth and more about substitution. Instead of developing your own voice, you borrow theirs. Instead of making your own choices, you ask what they would do. And instead of becoming more of yourself, you become more of them. And the scary part is, you might not even realize it because it feels so natural, like progress, like clarity. This is especially common during moments of uncertainty, when you feel lost, insecure, or overwhelmed, because the presence of a strong, idealized figure gives you something to hold onto, a way to feel stable or inspired or purposeful. And in a culture flooded with curated lives, polished brands, and endless advice, it's easy to mistake someone else's path for your own. You might see this in someone who changes their personality every time they find a new hero, someone who adopts the lifestyle of every influencer they follow, someone who repeats the language of their favorite author as if it were their own, or someone who defends their idol with more emotion than they defend their own beliefs. Because when the role model becomes a substitute for identity, criticism of them feels like a personal attack. The psychology behind this is rooted in a human need for belonging and coherence. When you feel fragmented or unsure, attaching to a strong external figure helps organize your thoughts, gives you a sense of purpose, direction, even morality, and in moderation this is helpful. But when the identification becomes too intense, you begin to outsource your thinking, your preferences, even your emotional reactions. You start watching your life as if you're a character in someone else's story, asking whether you're being like them enough, whether your decisions align with how they would act, whether you're living up to their example, and the cost is subtle but dangerous. You stop feeling your own intuition, and you start second-guessing your impulses because you've confused admiration with alignment. This pattern is especially pronounced in adolescence, when identity is still forming, but it can persist into adulthood, particularly in people who struggle with low self-esteem, lack of direction, or who were taught early on that being themselves wasn't enough, and so they reach for models of perfection, hoping to earn worth by becoming someone else. But the danger isn't just in losing your individuality, it's in building your self-image on a fantasy, because role models, by nature, are filtered, selective, idealized. You see their highlights, their strengths, their public faces. And when you compare your messy, complicated self to that edited image, you always come up short, which fuels shame, insecurity, and sometimes even resentment. Over-identification can also lead to emotional instability. If your role model fails, you feel like you've failed. If they change direction, you feel betrayed. If they're criticized, you feel attacked. Because your sense of self is tied to someone you don't control, and their journey begins to shape your emotional state, not just your aspirations. This isn't to say you shouldn't have role models. They can be deeply inspiring, even life-changing, but when admiration becomes mimicry, and when mimicry becomes identity, you lose the one thing they never had: your unique perspective, your lived experience, your story. To step out of this pattern, you don't have to reject the people you admire. You just have to separate appreciation from assimilation. Ask yourself not just what would they do, but what do I actually want? And notice when you're acting out of imitation rather than intention. It helps to return to your own inner world, your preferences, your values, your curiosities, even the ones that don't align with your role models, because that's where identity begins to reclaim its shape, not in copying greatness, but in shaping your own definition of it. Because in the end, the people you admire became who they are not by becoming someone else, but by following their own messy, uncertain, unique path, and the best way to honor them is not to mirror their life, but to live yours fully, even if it looks nothing like theirs. You make a mistake, maybe it's something small like saying the wrong thing in a conversation or forgetting to follow up on something important. Maybe it's something bigger like disappointing someone close to you or failing to live up to your own expectations. And the moment it happens, you feel that familiar wave of discomfort rise inside you, a mix of guilt and heat and tension in your chest, and almost instantly your brain starts trying to fix it, not necessarily the situation, but the feeling. Because shame, even in small doses, makes you feel unsafe, exposed, unworthy, and your mind doesn't like that, so it does what it always does: it tries to take control. At first, it might look like overthinking. You go back over the situation again and again, imagining how it looked from every angle, trying to find the perfect explanation, the perfect justification, maybe the perfect version of yourself that wouldn't have made the mistake. And in doing this, you're not just analyzing, you're rehearsing control, because in your mind, if you could control how it happened, maybe next time you can prevent it from happening at all. But the control doesn't stop there, it leaks into other areas. Maybe you become more rigid with yourself, more perfectionistic, more critical. Maybe you start avoiding situations where you might mess up again, or you begin managing other people's perceptions of you more tightly, always curating, always anticipating judgment, and without realizing it, you've entered the shame-control loop, a psychological cycle where every experience of shame leads to an increase in control behaviors. And every increase in control leaves you more vulnerable to shame the next time something slips through. The pattern is subtle but powerful, and it usually starts young. Maybe you were a child who got praised when you were good and corrected when you were bad. Maybe the corrections were mild or maybe they were harsh. But either way, you learned that mistakes were threats to your belonging, that failure meant disappointment, that emotions like embarrassment or rejection weren't just temporary feelings, they were signs that something was wrong with you. And so you learned to manage yourself, your actions, your image, your emotions, to minimize the risk of shame. As you got older, the pattern became more complex. When something went wrong, you blamed yourself. When someone was upset, you assumed it was your fault. When you felt anxious, you tried to hide it, to fix it, to make it invisible. and this became a kind of strategy, not for healing, but for survival, and it worked in a way because you got better at avoiding shame, but not better at processing it. Because the control doesn't actually resolve the shame, it just delays it, disguises it, pushes it under more control. You get into a cycle where you keep raising the bar for yourself, thinking that if you're just careful enough, competent enough, composed enough, you won't feel that terrible feeling again. But you do, because the more tightly you control your world, the more fragile your self-worth becomes, and the more devastating every small failure feels. Imagine you're in a conversation and someone interrupts you, and your first thought is just, "That was rude. It's, did I say something wrong?" Or you get a text that sounds neutral but you read it as cold, and suddenly you're wondering if you upset them, and you reread the message 5 times. Maybe you draft a careful response, trying to control the narrative, and all of this comes from one place: the fear of being perceived as wrong, unworthy, shameful. In some cases, the control becomes obsessive. People micromanage their calendars, their food, their appearance, their relationships, not because they enjoy control, but because the loss of control brings up shame, the feeling of being weak, messy, exposed, and the control becomes a shield, a way to stay safe but also a prison because it never ends. And what's more, this pattern often goes unnoticed, because it looks like responsibility, discipline, ambition, things that society praises, but underneath it, there's tension, exhaustion, fear, because it's not driven by peace, it's driven by a desire to avoid emotional pain. The problem is, when you live this way, you stop taking risks, not just big ones, but even small ones. You stop saying what you really think because you might be wrong. You stop trying new things because you might fail. You stop being fully present because you're constantly scanning for danger, and life starts to shrink, not because the world is small, but because shame has made it feel unsafe. The shame control loop also affects relationships. You might become overly accommodating, trying to avoid conflict, or overly controlling, trying to prevent rejection, and both of these create distance, not connection. You're not showing up as your full self, you're showing up as a version of yourself Daisy. Need to be acceptable, to be unshameable, and while that might feel safer, it also feels lonelier, because no one really knows you. So how do you break the loop? It starts with noticing not just the moments of shame, but the moments of control that follow, asking yourself, what am I trying to fix right now? What feeling am I trying to avoid? And sometimes the answer is hard to face, because it means sitting with the very thing you've built your life around avoiding, the feeling of not being enough, not being in control, not being safe. But here's the truth: control doesn't heal shame. Compassion does not pity, not excuse-making, but honest, grounded compassion, the kind that says, of course you're trying to be perfect, of course you're trying to manage everything, you're scared, and that's okay, but you don't have to live this way forever. In practical terms, it means letting yourself be human, making small mistakes, and resisting the urge to punish yourself, having uncomfortable conversations without rehearsing every line, allowing yourself to be seen, even when you're not polished, and noticing that when shame shows up, you can breathe through it instead of controlling around it. The goal isn't to eliminate shame, it's a universal emotion, everyone feels it. The goal is to stop letting it dictate how tightly you live, how much of yourself you hide, how much energy you spend avoiding feelings that are natural, temporary, and survivable. Because the more you allow yourself to experience shame without running from it, the more it loses its power, and the less you need to control everything to feel safe, and in that space, something incredible happens. You begin to trust yourself, not because you're perfect, but because you know that even when you're not, you're still worthy, still whole, still allowed to be here. That's where freedom begins, not in getting everything right, but in realizing that you never had to. You stay in a situation that hurts you, not because you don't know it hurts, but because the hurt is tangled with care, because the same person who causes the pain is the one who offers comfort afterward, and somewhere along the way, you've stopped being able to tell the difference between love and fear, between closeness and survival, between needing someone and being trapped. And every time you try to leave, something in you pulls back, not with logic, but with something deeper, something emotional. Something wired into how you've learned to feel safe, even when safety has never been truly safe. This is the reality of attachment confusion in high-stress bonds, a psychological pattern where emotional attachment forms under unstable, intense, or threatening conditions, creating relationships that feel both deeply connected and deeply harmful. And the confusion comes from the fact that your brain begins to associate distress with bonding, inconsistency with affection, and pain with love, because that's the pattern your nervous system has adapted to, especially if those dynamics existed in early life. Imagine you're a child and the person who feeds you also yells at you, the person who hugs you also frightens you, The person who comforts you after a bad day is the same person who caused the tears. Your mind, still forming, still plastic, still learning what relationships are, doesn't have the capacity to separate these roles, so it does the only thing it can. It binds them together, it fuses pain and comfort into one emotional experience. And from that point on, love doesn't feel safe unless it also feels intense, unpredictable, or difficult. This pattern can show up in adult relationships that feel magnetic and overwhelming at first, where someone is incredibly attentive, then suddenly distant, where warmth is followed by coldness, where apologies always follow damage, and where you begin to feel addicted to the cycle, constantly chasing the version of the person who once made you feel special, while tolerating the version who now makes you feel small, and you tell yourself that the good outweighs the bad. Even when the good becomes rarer and the bad becomes normal. The confusion deepens when your attachment style becomes activated in high-stress bonds, especially those involving emotional manipulation, trauma, or volatility. Your sense of self-worth begins to attach to the relationship's status, not because it's good, but because it's familiar and because unpredictability keeps you emotionally on edge. When things are going well, you feel relief, not joy, and when things go badly, you feel anxiety, not clarity, and over time, you begin to interpret the anxiety itself as proof of importance. You might catch yourself thinking things like, "But we've been through so much," or "They only act that way because they're stressed," or "I know deep down they love me." And while some of these things might be true, the emotional logic behind them is often flawed. You're not evaluating the relationship on its health or mutual respect. You're measuring it by intensity, history, and hope. And that's how the bond becomes stronger the more unstable it is. From the outside, this can look like weakness or foolishness. People wonder why you don't just leave, why you don't protect yourself, why you still care. But inside the pattern, everything makes sense because the chaos feels strangely familiar, and the fear of losing the attachment feels more unbearable than the cost of staying. And that's not irrational, that's conditioning, that's biology, that's the way attachment systems work when they've been shaped under pressure. The psychological mechanism at play is often rooted in what's called disorganized attachment, where the person you depend on is also a source of fear or instability, and this creates an internal conflict, where the impulse to move closer for safety is tangled with the impulse to move away to avoid harm, and the result is emotional paralysis, self-blame, confusion, and a persistent belief that if you could just do things differently, you'd finally earn consistent love. In many high-stress bonds, you become hyper-tuned to the other person's moods, walking on eggshells, trying to avoid triggering their anger or withdrawal. You monitor their tone, their silences, their messages, constantly adapting yourself to keep things calm. And this survival strategy often comes at the cost of your own needs, your own emotions, your own identity, because being loved starts to feel like a performance, not a right. This doesn't only happen in romantic relationships. It can happen with parents, friends, even workplaces, anywhere that your sense of emotional security becomes dependent on someone unpredictable. And the longer you stay, the more your sense of normal shifts. You start to doubt your reactions, question your perceptions, and eventually you lose touch with how stable relations hips are even supposed to feel. One of the cruelest aspects of this syndrome is the way it teaches you to internalize blame. You start to believe that if you're feeling confused or hurt, it's your fault, that you're too sensitive, too demanding, too much, because every time you tried to set a boundary or express pain, it was met with dismissal, defensiveness, or guilt-tripping. And eventually you learn to turn your questions inward, asking what's wrong with you instead of asking what's wrong with the dynamic. The psychological cost is heavy. You live in a state of hypervigilance, always alert for shifts in tone, always wondering when the next rupture will happen, and the body interprets this emotional stress as physical threat, flooding you with cortisol, tightening your chest, exhausting your energy, and yet despite all this, you still feel tethered, still feel attached, because that's how deep the wiring goes. The confusion isn't weakness, it's learned survival, and the longer the bond lasts, the more tangled it becomes, because your identity begins to form around the role you've taken. The fixer, the forgiver, the emotional caretaker, the one who stays no matter what, and that role becomes hard to release, not just because of loyalty or love, but because without it, you're not sure who you are anymore. Breaking the cycle means first recognizing it, naming the confusion, acknowledging the contradiction, seeing that care doesn't cancel harm, and then gently beginning the work of untangling love from fear, attachment from pain, and history from worth, not all at once, and not without grief, but slowly, steadily, with compassion for the version of you that did what it needed to survive. It might mean distancing yourself emotionally before you can leave physically, or it might mean working through the roots of the pattern in therapy, or it might mean finding safe people who model what stable connection looks like, not perfect, but consistent, and letting your nervous system relearn what it feels like to be seen without being hurt, to be loved without needing to prove anything. And in that process, the confusion begins to fade, not because the memories disappear, but because clarity returns. You start to recognize which feelings are yours and which were shaped by the chaos. You start to reclaim your emotional boundaries, and most importantly, you begin to believe, not just intellectually but viscerally, that love should not make you feel small, scared, or erased. Because real connection doesn't ask you to abandon yourself to keep it, and real healing doesn't come from enduring more pain, but from choosing yourself over and over until the confusion clears and safety feels like peace, not adrenaline.